8 men destroyed my career, my mentor, and my life, she said, her voice steady despite everything. And they're laughing about it right now across this ballroom. The stranger beside her didn't flinch. He didn't offer sympathy. He simply looked across the room at the 8 men laughing beneath the chandeliers and said quietly, "Not for much longer." If you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Bennett had exactly $11 in her savings account on the night she wore the emerald green dress. She had almost returned it 3 times. She'd stood in front of her bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning with the receipt in her hand, the dress still on its hanger behind her, and told herself it was irresponsible. That she couldn't afford it. That she had no business walking into a room full of people who had destroyed her as though she belonged there. But she kept it. Not because she was foolish with money. Clara had never been foolish with money. She'd put herself through college on a combination of scholarships and weekend shifts, earned her financial investigator's license before most of her classmates had landed their first real jobs, and built a reputation in this city on discipline and precision. She understood numbers the way other people understood breathing, automatically, constantly, without having to try. She kept the dress because walking into that ballroom in something beautiful was the only act of defiance she had left. And Clara Bennett was not ready to stop fighting, even if her bank account suggested otherwise. She arrived at the Whitmore Grand at 10:15 p.m., 30 minutes after the doors opened, which was the calculated window she had decided on late enough that the room was full, and nobody would notice a single arrival, early enough that she wouldn't seem desperate by coming in at the tail end. She had planned it the way she planned everything, methodically, with backup scenarios in case the primary plan failed. What she had not planned for was how it would feel to walk through those doors. The Whitmore Grand Ballroom had been a landmark in the city for over 60 years, a place where real estate deals were finalized over glasses of Burgundy, where political alliances were quietly cemented between courses of food nobody actually ate, where money spoke in a dialect Clara had spent her entire career learning to translate. The chandeliers alone cost more than she had earned in the last year. She knew this, because she had once investigated a similar property and spent 3 weeks auditing procurement records for decorative lighting. She knew this world. She had walked through it with confidence for 6 years. And then, in the span of 4 weeks, 8 men had taken that world from her and handed her $11 and the ruins of everything she had built. Clara accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and did not drink it. She held it because holding a glass gave her hands something to do, and because people at events like this always looked more comfortable when they were holding something. She had learned that years ago. Little social tricks. Ways to move through rooms without drawing attention when you needed to observe rather than be observed. She moved along the east wall. She listened. She kept her expression exactly neutral, not cold, not warm, just pleasant and composed, the face of someone having a perfectly adequate evening. She had practiced it. She was not ashamed of that. She had stood in front of her bathroom mirror for 3 days after the investigation collapsed and practiced exactly this expression because she knew there would be a moment like this one, a room like this one, and she refused to let them see the damage. They would not get that. Whatever else they had taken from her, they would not get that. Clara Bennett. She turned. A woman she vaguely recognized from the periphery of her professional life. A PR consultant who worked with several financial firms, thin-faced, expensive jewelry. The kind of smile that was always performing, was looking at her with an expression that was somewhere between surprised and uncomfortable. "I didn't expect to see you here," the woman said. Her name came to Clara after a moment. Patricia Morse. She had once attended a panel discussion where Clara was a speaker. "I come every year," Clara said pleasantly. This was not true. She had attended twice in the past 6 years. But Patricia Morse would not know that, and the response accomplished what it needed to. It suggested normalcy, continuity, a life that had not been catastrophically interrupted. Patricia's smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind it. "Of course. Well, it's good to see you're, Doing well. The hesitation before doing well carried an entire conversation Clara had no interest in having. Always, she said, and turned back to the room. She felt Patricia watching her for another moment before moving away. Clara already knew what Patricia would do next. She would find someone she knew and say quietly that Clara Bennett was here, if you can believe it, after everything. And the person Patricia told would tell someone else. And within 20 minutes, half the room would know she was here. That was fine. Let them look. She wanted to be seen. She wanted every single one of them to see her standing upright in this room. What she had not wanted, what she had not permitted herself to fully anticipate, was seeing all 8 of them at once. But there they were, standing in a loose cluster near the far end of the ballroom, arranged around a high-top table with drinks in hand, filling the space they occupied with a kind of casual, unconcerned confidence that Clara felt like a physical blow to the chest. They were laughing. Not a polite social function laugh, a real laugh, the laugh of men who were genuinely enjoying themselves, who had nothing pressing on their consciences, who had come to this event to celebrate and not to hide. She knew their names the way she knew the names of every significant piece of evidence she had ever collected. Marcus Hale, 62 years old, former chairman of Vantage Capital, the one who had first identified her investigation as a threat and made the call to neutralize it. Dennis Rourke, 58, real estate developer and investment fund manager. He had provided the forged documentation that made her appear to have manipulated the evidence she'd collected. Gerald Whitfield, 65, insurance executive. He had gone to Clara's supervisor with a story about her professional misconduct, so detailed and so calmly delivered that her supervisor had believed every word of it within 20 minutes. She knew all 8 of them. She had spent 11 months learning everything about them, their companies, their holdings, their histories, the quiet back channels through which their money moved and multiplied. She had built a case that she believed was airtight. She had been wrong. Not about the case. The case was solid. She had been wrong about what solid meant when money was involved. Solid meant nothing when the men you were investigating had more resources than the institution you worked for. Solid meant nothing when they could afford to be patient and creative in ways that a 30-year-old investigator working within the constraints of procedure and law simply could not match. So they had destroyed her first. It took them 4 weeks. It felt like 4 years. And her mentor, Richard Aldridge, the man who had hired her fresh out of her certification program, who had spent a decade teaching her how to follow financial trails through the most labyrinthine corporate structures she had ever encountered, Richard had not survived it. He had died 8 weeks after the investigation collapsed. Not dramatically, not in any way that made headlines. He had died at 71 years old after a cardiac event in a hospital bed, with his reputation shredded and his life's work discredited, and his name attached to the same false narrative they had constructed to bury her. The obituaries had been kind, respectful. They mentioned his decades of service and did not dwell on the recent trouble. But Clara knew what had really killed him. She had sat at his bedside for the last 6 hours of his life, and she had not told him she was going to fix it, because she did not make promises she was not certain she could keep. She had simply held his hand. And when he was gone, she had walked out of the hospital and sat in her car in the parking structure and did not cry because she was afraid that if she started, she would not be able to stop. She had not cried since. She was not crying now. She was standing 40 feet from the 8 men who had done all of this, holding a glass of champagne she had not touched, performing the smile she had practiced in her bathroom mirror and refusing to break. But her grip on the champagne glass was tight enough that she could feel the pressure in her fingers. That expression. The voice came from her left, close enough to be private, but not so close as to crowd her. A man's voice, low, even. The kind of voice that did not need to be loud to be heard. "Which expression?" she said, not looking away from the room. "The one you're wearing right now," the man said. "It's very practiced, very convincing." A brief pause. "But you're holding that glass like you want to throw it at someone." Clara turned. The man standing beside her was perhaps 40 or so, she estimated, though something about the stillness in his face made him difficult to place precisely. He was dressed well in the understated way that indicated real money rather than performed money. No logos, nothing flashy, just quality that announced itself through cut and fabric and the kind of fit that came from something made specifically for one person. Dark eyes. A face that was composed in a way that reminded her oddly of her own practiced expression, except that his wasn't practiced. His was simply how he was. He was holding a glass of mineral water and looking at her with a directness that most people at events like this carefully avoided. People at events like this were expert at looking without appearing to look. This man was simply looking. "I don't believe we've met," she said. "We haven't," he agreed. "Are you going to introduce yourself?" "In a moment," he said. "First that expression, the smile." "What about it?" "It's beautiful," he said. And before she could decide how to receive that, he added, "Which makes it more interesting that it looks like something you're wearing to survive the evening, not because you're enjoying yourself." Clara said nothing. She turned back to the room. After a moment, she said, "Most people at these things are performing something." "True," he said, "but most of them don't look like they're fighting to stay standing." The words landed somewhere she had not expected. Not as a wound, more like pressure on a bruise she had forgotten was there enough to remind her of it without making it worse. She looked at him again. "Why are you talking to me?" she asked, not hostile, just honest, direct. She was too tired for social choreography. He considered the question seriously, which she appreciated. "Because," he said, "I've been in this room for an hour and 40 minutes, and you are the only genuinely interesting thing in it." "That's a line." "It's an observation," he said. "I notice things. It's something of an occupational habit." "What's your occupation?" "Asset management," he said. The slight pause before the answer was barely perceptible. "Of a variety of interests." Clara studied him for a moment. The composure, the precision of his language, the way his eyes moved through the room with a quality that reminded her of something she had encountered before, something she associated not with finance or law, but with an older, quieter kind of authority. The kind that didn't need institutions behind it. "Adrian Valenti," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, nothing so ordinary as that. More like recalibration. "You know who I am. I'm a financial investigator," she said. "Or I was. Your name comes up in certain research contexts." "Certain research contexts," he repeated. "Nothing actionable," she said. "You're careful." "I'm thorough," he corrected. The distinction felt deliberate. She looked back across the ballroom, at the cluster of men who were still laughing, still comfortable, still untouched by everything they had done. "Who killed your smile?" Adrian asked. The question was so direct, so stripped of the social cushioning people usually wrapped around personal questions that it took her a moment. She pointed. Not dramatically, just a small, precise gesture toward the far end of the room. "The 8 men laughing over there," she said. "The ones having a wonderful evening." Adrian Valenti looked, and Clara, who had spent 11 months studying the faces of dangerous people, watched his face change in a way that was almost imperceptible. A small shift in the quality of his attention, a focusing like a lens adjusting. He looked at those men the way a person looked at something they were deciding what to do with. "Tell me about them," he said. And Clara, who had not spoken at length to anyone about this since Richard died, found herself talking. She had not planned to. She did not fully understand why she did. Maybe it was the hour, the compressed exhaustion of performing wellness for a room full of people who had watched her fall. Maybe it was the directness he offered, the absence of pity or awkward reassurance. Maybe it was simply that he had asked without flinching, as though he was prepared for whatever the answer was. She kept her voice quiet and her face pleasant, and she told him about the investigation, about the 11 months of work, about the 7 companies she had traced through 4 layers of shell structures, about the 312 workers who had lost their jobs when those companies collapsed, workers who had done nothing wrong, workers who were still trying to reconstruct their lives 2 years later. About the false evidence. About Richard. Adrian listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer consolation or outrage or advice. He simply listened with the complete, unhurried attention of someone for whom information was the most valuable commodity in the world. When she finished, she felt oddly lighter. Not fixed. Not better exactly, but lighter. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want them to answer for what they did." Not revenge. She thought about it honestly. "I want what I wanted before. The truth. I want the truth to mean something." Adrian Valenti looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the 8 men across the room. "It will," he said. The certainty in his voice was not the certainty of a promise or a reassurance. It was the certainty of someone stating a fact about something they had already decided. Clara did not know what to make of that, but she also did not dismiss it. They stood together in silence for a while, which was comfortable in a way that silence between strangers usually was not. The band played something slow and orchestral across the room. The crowd moved and murmured. The 8 men laughed at something and clinked their glasses. "What will you do now?" Adrian asked. "After tonight." "Go home," she said. "Keep looking for another way in. The evidence still exists somewhere. I know it does. They couldn't have destroyed all of it." She paused. "I'll find it." "You believe that?" "I have to believe that," she said. "Otherwise, everything Richard went through meant nothing." Something moved through Adrian's expression. Not quite sympathy. He did not seem to be the kind of man who did sympathy in the conventional sense. Something else. Recognition, maybe. "He was important to you," he said. "He was the only person in this industry who ever actually invested in me," she said. "Not my work. Me. He used to say that the numbers were just the map, that the real job was understanding what people were willing to do to each other for money." She looked down at the champagne she still hadn't touched. "He was right. I just didn't understand how right until they proved it." "What was his name?" "Richard Aldridge." A pause. Then, "I know that name." She looked at him quickly. "He testified in a securities case about 14 years ago," Adrian said. "A matter involving a fund that had significant exposure to certain markets I was monitoring at the time. He was thorough and honest, which was unusual in that context." Clara had not expected that. "You knew his work." "I respected it," Adrian said. From a distance. She looked at him. This man whose name came up in research contexts, who spoke about monitoring markets in a way that suggested the markets were the least of what he monitored. And she felt something she had not felt in 6 months. The fragile, precarious beginning of trust. She did not act on it. She was too careful for that. But she noted it. "I should circulate," she said, because she had done what she came to do. She had stood in this room and not collapsed, and she was reaching the limit of how long she could sustain the performance without it costing her something she needed for tomorrow. "Of course," he said. He reached into his jacket. Not a business card, nothing so ordinary, and said simply, "If you decide you want to talk more about the investigation." He named a number. Just a number, no name attached to it. She memorized it. "I probably won't call," she said. "Probably?" He agreed. And the way he said it suggested he understood that probably and certainly were very different things. Clara made her way around the perimeter of the room. She spoke to 3 people she recognized, kept each conversation to 5 minutes, did not discuss herself, and moved on. She was operating on a frequency that was partly social function and partly something else entirely, a background process running quietly beneath everything else, cataloging, processing, storing. She found herself near the cluster of 8 men 20 minutes after leaving Adrian. Not on purpose. At least she told herself it wasn't on purpose. Marcus Hale was speaking. He was describing something about a recent acquisition she caught enough to understand. It was a commercial property deal, and the men around him were nodding with the specific experienced nodding of people who understood the numbers being discussed and found them impressive. She stood 6 feet away, apparently absorbed in the room, and listened. What she heard in 60 seconds made her feel sick. Not because the content was new. She had suspected Hale's firm was already moving on to the next set of targets. That was how these operations worked. They were not episodic but continuous, a perpetual engine that needed regular fuel in the form of other people's assets. She had suspected it. Hearing him describe it aloud, comfortably surrounded by men who were complicit or indifferent, or both that was different from suspicion. She made herself walk away before her expression changed. She found a quiet corner near the side exit and stood with her back to the wall and breathed through the anger and the helplessness and the grief for Richard and the absolute crystalline fury of knowing that they were already doing it again, and there was still nothing she could do about it. There was nothing. She had the skills and the knowledge and the professional history to build another case, but she did not have the institutional backing, the resources, or the credibility anymore. They had taken that. And without it, she was just a woman with a story that the people in power had already decided was not credible. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text message. She opened it. 3 words. Don't leave yet. She looked up, scanned the room, found Adrian Valenti across the ballroom near the balcony doors, watching her with that particular steady focus. She typed back, "Why?" The reply came in seconds. "Because in approximately 4 minutes, the man who coordinated the false evidence against you is going to make a mistake. And I want you to witness it." Her pulse shifted. Not dramatically, she controlled that, but shifted. She typed, "How do you know that?" His reply, "Because I've spent the last 3 days learning everything about all 8 of them. And because I had a conversation this evening that motivated me to accelerate something I had been considering for a while." Her fingers went still on the phone. She thought about that. 3 days. He had been at this for 3 days. Before tonight. Before she had told him anything. She looked across the room at him, and he was still watching her with that same level measured attention, and she could not read in his face whether this was protection or strategy, or something that had no clean category in the vocabulary she had built for herself. She typed, "What kind of conversation?" He replied, "The one where a woman in an emerald dress told me about 11 months of work, and a man named Richard Aldridge." She stared at that message for a long moment. The first conversation had been real, she decided. Or real enough. As real as anything involving a man like Adrian Valenti could reasonably be. She typed, "What am I watching for?" He replied, "Dennis Rourke. Northeast corner. He's been on his phone for the last 8 minutes. He's going to step outside in approximately 2 minutes. What happens after that is going to be unpleasant for him." Clara looked toward the northeast corner. Dennis Rourke, 58, the one who had supplied the forged documentation, was indeed on his phone, his body language tight in a way that the ambient noise of the ballroom was masking, but that she could read from 40 feet away. He was receiving bad news. She watched. 2 minutes and 40 seconds later, Rourke put his phone in his pocket, said something brief to the man next to him, and walked quickly toward the side exit. The side exit near where Clara was standing. He passed within 10 feet of her. He did not recognize her. Or if he did, the news he had just received was significant enough to override social awareness. His face was gray. She had seen men receive news that changed their situations. She knew what it looked like. Whatever Dennis Rourke had just learned, it had changed something fundamental about the evening he was having. She looked across the room. Adrian Valenti was no longer watching her. He was looking at something else. His expression as composed as it had been all evening, holding his mineral water with a patience that was almost meditative. Clara stood in her corner and felt the architecture of the evening shift around her. Something was already in motion. She did not fully know what. But she was beginning to understand that Adrian Valenti's certainty, had not been an expression of intent. It had been an expression of progress. She waited until she was certain she had everything she could gather from the room, until she had observed all 8 men for as long as she could manage without the observation becoming conspicuous, until she had done everything that had brought her here tonight. Then she left. She did not say goodbye to Adrian Valenti. He was deep in conversation with 2 other men by the time she was ready to go, and she did not interrupt. But she stopped near the balcony doors because she was close enough to him that she could speak quietly without it being public. She said, "Thank you for the conversation." He glanced at her, just briefly. "Get home safe," he said, and then below that quiet enough that only she could hear it. "You'll hear from me soon." She walked out of the Whitmore Grand at 12:22 a.m. She held herself together through the lobby. She held herself together in the elevator down to the parking structure. She held herself together walking to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and put both hands on the steering wheel and closed her eyes. She thought about Richard, about the way he had explained the job to her once early on, when she was still learning the difference between finding evidence and understanding what it meant. He had said the numbers tell you what people did, but you have to work out why, and the why is always about what they were afraid of. She thought about 8 men who had been afraid of her and had destroyed her because of it. She thought about a man in a dark suit who had spent 3 days learning everything about those 8 men before he ever spoke to her. She thought about the word accelerate and what it meant from someone who chose his words with that kind of deliberate care. She did not know what Adrian Valenti was. She knew what people said about him in the research contexts where his name appeared. She knew the contours of his reputation, the way you knew the shape of something in the dark, not clearly, but distinctly the outline without the details. She knew he was dangerous. She knew that the things people whispered about him were probably not exaggerated or not significantly. She knew that the men who ran organizations like his did not spend 3 days researching 8 financial executives because of abstract principles of justice. She started the car. She drove home through empty streets. And the whole way she held in her mind the image of Dennis Rourke's gray face and the certainty in Adrian Valenti's voice, and the word that had been pressing against the inside of her chest since she left the ballroom. Soon. He had said soon. And she believed him, not because she was naive. Clara Bennett had not been naive about anything since she was 19 years old and first learned how many different shapes dishonesty could take. She believed him because she had spent her career learning to read people through the evidence they left behind, and everything Adrian Valenti had done tonight, the positioning, the timing, the precision of his information, the 3 days of preparation he had begun before they ever spoke, pointed in one direction. He was already moving. The 8 men who had gathered tonight to laugh and drink and celebrate their continued invulnerability had not known that a different guest at the Whitmore Grand was watching them, cataloging them, understanding them, not for research purposes, for something considerably more consequential. Clara parked outside her building, sat for another moment in the silence, and thought about what it meant to want justice and what it meant to want the truth, and whether those 2 things always led to the same place. She thought about Richard telling her that the numbers were just the map. She thought about the fact that Adrian Valenti was someone who operated entirely without maps. He didn't need them. He already knew the territory. She got out of the car. She went upstairs. She took off the emerald dress and hung it carefully and made a cup of tea she barely drank. She sat at her desk in the quiet of her apartment and opened the folder she had been keeping for 6 months. Printed documents, handwritten notes, the skeletal remains of the investigation. She had not been able to stop rebuilding in her own time, on her own resources, without institutional support or credibility or anything, except the absolute conviction that the truth still existed somewhere and that she was still capable of finding it. Her phone was on the desk beside her. She looked at the unknown number in her messages. She looked at the folder. She looked out the window at the city that had swallowed everything she built and spat out $11 and a reputation in pieces. She made a decision. Not about trust. She was not ready for trust. About what came next. She opened a new document on her computer, and at the top, she typed a heading. She typed what they didn't destroy, and she began to write. She wrote until 4 in the morning, until her hands were stiff and her eyes burned, writing down everything she remembered, and everything she had reconstructed, and everything she suspected, and everything she could still prove. Not because she had a plan, because she was Clara Bennett. And Clara Bennett did not stop. Not when they destroyed her career. Not when they killed Richard. Not when they took everything except the $11 and the dress and the knowledge they had never been able to reach. Not even now. She wrote, and outside her window, the city moved through its quiet, dark hours. And somewhere in that city, a man named Adrian Valenti was doing something he had decided to do 3 days ago. And it was already in motion, and by the time the sun came up, something in the world she was fighting had already begun to shift. She did not know exactly what yet, but she could feel it. The way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Something was coming. And this time, for the first time in 6 months, Clara Bennett was not afraid of it. Clara found out about Daniel Cross at 6:47 in the morning. She had not slept. She had been at her desk since leaving the Whitmore Grand, and the document she had titled "What They Didn't Destroy" had grown to 11 pages of dense, carefully organized notes, before exhaustion finally forced her to stop adding to it and simply stare at it. She had made coffee twice. She had not drunk either cup while it was hot. The news alert came through on her phone while she was in the middle of rereading a section about the shell company structures she had traced through 3 separate offshore jurisdictions before the investigation collapsed. The headline was simple, almost boring the way that genuinely significant things sometimes were. Prominent investor Daniel Cross reported missing, following private engagement. Clara read it 3 times. Then she put her phone face down on the desk and sat very still. Daniel Cross was not one of the most visible of the 8. He was not the architect that was Marcus Hale, and he was not the one who had built the false evidence against her that was Dennis Rourke. Daniel Cross was the money, the quiet money, the kind that moved through structures so layered that even she had needed 4 months to trace his actual involvement, and what she had found was that he was the one who had funded the operation, who had approved the decision to destroy her when the investigation became a problem, who had signed off on it the way he signed off on quarterly projections efficiently without apparent emotion as a practical matter of business. He was 60 years old. He had a wife and 3 adult children and a foundation that gave money to literacy programs for underprivileged kids, which she had always found particularly galling given what she knew about him. And now he was missing. She picked up her phone and read the full article. It was thin on detail, as early breaking stories usually were. Cross had been expected home the previous evening from what his family described as a private business dinner. He had not arrived. His phone was going to voicemail. His driver had been dismissed early and could not account for the final portion of the evening. There were no witnesses to his last known movements after approximately 10 p.m. That was 45 minutes before Clara had entered the Whitmore Grand. She put the phone down again. She stared at the ceiling. She told herself that the timing was probably coincidental, that men like Daniel Cross had complicated lives with complicated enemies, and his disappearance did not necessarily have anything to do with the conversation she had last night in a ballroom with a man whose name appeared in research contexts. She told herself this for approximately 90 seconds. Then her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Not the same unknown number as last night. A different one. The message contained 4 words. 1 down. 7 remain. Clara's hands were absolutely steady as she set the phone on the desk. She had always been steadiest when the situation was most serious. It was a quality Richard had noticed early and valued, and it had served her consistently across 11 months of an investigation that had required nerves she had not known she possessed. She was steady now, but her mind was moving fast. She thought about Adrian Valenti standing beside her at the Whitmore Grand and looking at the 8 men across the room. She thought about the quality of attention she had seen in his face in that moment, the focusing, the recalibration. She thought about the text message telling her to stay because Dennis Rourke was about to make a mistake, and the gray color of Rourke's face when he walked past her toward the exit, and the word soon. She thought about 3 days. He had told her he had spent 3 days learning everything about all 8 of them. 3 days, before they ever spoke. She picked up the phone and called the unknown number. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. She did not leave a message. She sat with what she was feeling, which was complicated in a way she did not have clean vocabulary for. The honest answer, if she was being honest with herself at 7 a.m., after no sleep with a cup of cold coffee and 11 pages of notes, was that the relief was real. She was not going to pretend otherwise, not to herself, because she had always believed that the beginning of every serious mistake was the moment when a person stopped being honest with themselves about what they actually wanted. She wanted those men to face consequences. She had wanted it for 6 months. The legal mechanisms she had trusted to deliver those consequences had been dismantled by the men themselves. The institution she had worked for had declined to rebuild the case. The colleagues who might have supported her had been persuaded frightened, or simply calculating their own interests in the way that people in every institution eventually did. The system had failed, and now something outside the system was moving. She should have been horrified. Part of her was, but a larger part, the part that had sat in a hospital room watching Richard Aldridge die with his reputation destroyed, and known that the people responsible were going to wake up the next morning and go to work and continue exactly as before, that part felt something different. She opened a new tab on her computer and started tracking every detail the news was reporting about Daniel Cross. There was not much yet, but there would be more. There was always more. By noon, there was considerably more. The Daniel Cross story had moved from the financial pages to the front page. Not the absolute top, there were other things competing but visible prominent, the kind of placement that indicated editors had decided this was significant. A second source had confirmed that Cross had received a phone call at approximately 9:45 the previous evening that had visibly disturbed him. A third source, described only as a close associate, said that Cross had been nervous about something for the past 2 weeks, without being willing to specify further. 2 weeks. Which meant that whatever Adrian Valenti had set in motion 3 days before the Whitmore ball, there had been something earlier that Daniel Cross had sensed or been warned about. She was reaching for her phone when it rang. Unknown number. Different from the previous two. She answered it. "You've seen the news," Adrian said. Not a question. His voice was exactly the same as it had been in the ballroom. Unhurried. Even. As though he were calling to discuss something routine. "I've been tracking it since 6:47 this morning," she said. "I know," he said. She paused. "You know when I woke up." "I know when you started accessing news sites," he said. "I told you I was thorough." Clara thought about what thorough meant in this context. She thought about it for precisely as long as it took her to decide that being disturbed by it was less useful than understanding it. "What happened to him?" she asked. "Nothing permanent," Adrian said. "He's unhurt." "That's not what I asked." A brief silence. "He's in a situation where he's had the opportunity to reflect on some decisions he made over the past several years," Adrian said, "and to consider whether his current position is one he wants to defend or one he wants to begin distancing himself from. You're giving him the chance to cooperate. I'm giving him information about what happens to people who don't," Adrian said. "It amounts to the same thing." Clara thought about the 312 workers, about Richard, about what cooperation would mean, evidence, testimony, the pieces that had been stripped from the case she had built. "Will it work?" she asked. "Cross is not a brave man," Adrian said. "He's a calculating one. He'll make the calculation that serves him best. I've arranged for the available options to be clear." "And the other 7 are becoming aware that something has changed," he said. "They don't know what yet. That uncertainty is useful." Clara sat back in her chair. The document on her screen, 11 pages of everything she could still prove, everything she remembered, every thread she had preserved, was open in front of her. "What do you need from me?" she asked. There was a pause that was different from his other pauses. Slightly longer. Slightly more textured. "Why do you assume I need something from you?" "Because you're not doing this out of abstract principle," she said. "You're doing it because you decided to, last night probably, which means it has something to do with our conversation, and if you're involving me by sending me messages about progress, you want me inside this rather than outside it." Another pause. "You're faster than I expected," he said. "I've been doing this for 6 years," she said. "I'm not fast. I just don't waste time on the wrong analysis." He made a sound that might have been in a different man the beginning of a laugh. "I need information," he said. "Specifically the parts of your investigation that were never formally documented. The things you knew but couldn't prove. The suspicions you couldn't include in the official record." The subtext. "The subtext," he agreed. Clara thought about this. Giving Adrian Valenti the informal record of her investigation, the things she had noted and catalogued and filed under probable but unverifiable, was not a small thing. It was not information she could pretend she hadn't given him once it was given. It would place her squarely inside whatever he was doing, and whatever he was doing existed in a space that was considerably outside her professional training in terms of legality and consequence. "I need to understand what you're going to do with it," she said. "Use it to accelerate the exposure," he said. "What I'm doing is not designed to harm them physically. It's designed to dismantle them. By terrifying them into making mistakes. By making the cost of holding their position higher than the cost of abandoning it," he said. "People like Cross and Rourke and the others, they built their operations on rational self-interest. I'm adjusting the available information so that rational self-interest leads them somewhere different. You're not going to hurt them. That depends on how you define hurt," he said. "Their finances, their reputations, their freedom of movement, those are going to suffer considerably. But they'll be alive and functional. More than Richard Aldridge was." He said Richard's name quietly and without apparent calculation, and she felt it the way she felt everything connected to Richard now, like pressure on something not fully healed. "The subtext," she said. "When do you need it?" "Today would be efficient," he said. "I can have something ready by 6 this evening. I'll send you a location." He ended the call. Clara sat in the sudden quiet of her apartment with the phone in her hand and felt the specific clarifying sensation of having crossed a line. Not necessarily the wrong line. She was not certain it was wrong. But a line she couldn't uncross, and she had crossed it with her eyes open, which was the only way she was willing to cross anything. She opened the document titled, "What They Didn't Destroy," and she started adding. The location Adrian sent was a private office on the 34th floor of a building in Midtown, not a corporate headquarters. Nothing so institutional, but one of those suites that certain people maintained as neutral meeting ground, the urban equivalent of a restaurant corner booth, where business could be conducted without being observed. Clara had been to 2 similar spaces in her career, both during investigations that had required discretion, and the address alone told her things about the resources available to Adrian Valenti that confirmed the assessment she had already made. She arrived at 6:03. He was already there. There were 2 other people in the room. A woman Clara estimated at around 35 precise-looking, with the organized stillness of someone who processed large amounts of information professionally, sitting at a laptop with an expression of complete concentration, and a man somewhere in his late 40s, broad and quiet, standing near the window in a way that was not decorative. "Clara," Adrian said. He did not say good evening or thank you for coming or any of the usual ornamental greetings. "This is Serena," a nod toward the woman, "and Marcus," a nod toward the man by the window. "You don't need to know their full names." "Understood," Clara said. "The document you prepared, 13 pages, she said. "I added to it this morning." She put a USB drive on the table. "Everything I knew that I couldn't put in the official record. Sources I didn't want to expose. Patterns I identified but couldn't formally document. Connections I was certain of but couldn't prove through standard channels." Serena picked up the drive with an efficiency that suggested she had been expecting exactly this. "There's something in there about a storage facility," Clara said. "In the section about Rourke. I believed at the time that the documentation he used to create the false evidence against me originated in a specific location, a private record storage contracted to one of his subsidiary companies. I couldn't get a warrant because the evidence for it was circular. I needed the documentation to prove I needed access to the documentation." Adrian was watching her with that focused attention. "You believe the original records are still there?" "I believe Rourke is the kind of man who keeps everything," she said. He built his career on documentation, on paper trails that he controlled. He wouldn't have destroyed the source material because he believed it was safe, because nobody was supposed to ever know it existed. And now someone does. You, she said. And me. And now Serena and Marcus, apparently. Adrian looked at Serena. Something passed between them in the wordless shorthand of people who had worked together extensively. Cross talked, Clara asked, reading the exchange. Cross is talking, Adrian said. He began talking approximately 14 hours ago and has not stopped. He's currently providing a detailed account of the financial arrangements that funded the operation against you. A pause. He mentioned the storage facility. Clara felt the air in the room change, or maybe it was just her own breathing. He confirmed it, she said. He named the specific subsidiary and the contract number, Adrian said, which Serena has already traced to a physical address. Clara looked at the woman behind the laptop who had not looked up from the screen during this exchange. How long have you been at this? She asked. Since 11 this morning, Serena said, not looking up. The offshore structures were well built, but they used 3 accounting firms across the 14-year period, and firms like that always leave patterns. Pattern recognition is not their strong suit. She glanced up briefly. Yours, on the other hand, appears to be excellent. The notes about the cash movement in the third quarter are going to be very useful. It was possibly the most direct professional compliment Clara had received in 6 months, and it came from a woman she had known for 11 minutes who worked for a man whose name appeared in research contexts. She sat down at the table. Walk me through what Cross said, she said. Adrian sat across from her. He confirmed that the decision to target you was made collectively by all 8 following a meeting approximately 13 months ago when your investigation first came to their attention through a contact inside your firm. Clara's hands tightened slightly on the edge of the table. I always suspected there was a leak. A junior analyst, Adrian said. Someone who owed Hale a professional debt and paid it with information about the investigation's progress. She thought about the junior analysts who had worked in proximity to her investigation. She had a name in mind almost immediately, someone who had asked the right questions a little too specifically, who had been promoted 6 weeks after the investigation collapsed. Do you have a name? Thomas Greer, Adrian said. Her jaw tightened. She had been right. She had been right, and she had been unable to prove it, and she had spent 6 months wondering whether her suspicion had been paranoia. He's still with the firm. Not as of this morning, Adrian said. He resigned at 9 a.m. By 9:15, the firm was aware of the reason. The speed of it landed in her chest. He had been systematically dismantling things since the previous night, since their conversation at the Whitmore Grand, and she had been in her apartment writing notes while the whole machinery around her was already in motion. How many of you are there? She asked. Working on this? Enough, he said. That's not an answer. It's the accurate one, he said. Not rudely, simply. The specific composition of my operations is not something I share broadly. I'm going to be useful to you, she said. Which means I'm inside this. Which means I'd like to understand what I'm inside. Adrian looked at her for a moment. She had the impression he was deciding something, not whether to trust her exactly, but how much to reveal about the shape of things, which was a different calculation. I have resources, he said. People who are good at finding information, at creating pressure, at managing the movement of circumstances. What I don't have until now is someone who understands the technical financial architecture of what these 8 men built. The subtext you described, the offshore structures, the circular documentation, the patterns. My people can find information. What they can't do is interpret it the way you can. You need a translator, she said. I need the person who already knows the language, he said. Clara looked at the table, then at the window behind Marcus, where the city was doing its midday business 43 floors below. Then at Adrian. I'm not going to pretend I'm comfortable with everything about this, she said. I want you to know that. I'm a licensed financial investigator. My instinct is to build cases that go to prosecutors that result in charges and trials and due process. I understand that. And I'm also aware, she said, that those mechanisms were what they destroyed in order to protect themselves. So I'm not operating on illusions about what the standard process can accomplish here. What are you operating on? He asked. She thought about Richard, about the specific irreversible fact of him being gone, about the workers who had lost their jobs and the companies that had been hollowed out for profit, and the documentation that somewhere in a storage facility in this city still existed waiting. Results, she said. I'm operating on the possibility of actual results. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. She was beginning to understand his face, beginning to map the small movements that served for him as what more expressive people did openly. What she saw now was something like acknowledgement, perhaps more than that. Then we understand each other, he said. They worked for 4 hours. Clara had not worked like this since before the investigation collapsed, at full engagement at full speed with people who matched her pace and her precision, and did not need her to slow down or explain her methodology. Serena was exceptional. She had a mind that organized complexity with a natural efficiency that Clara recognized as the kind of intelligence you couldn't teach, you could only find it. She followed Clara's explanations of the financial structures without needing them, asked exactly the right questions at exactly the right moments, and produced output that was clean and precise and faster than anything Clara had seen from a team 3 times the size. Marcus did not participate in the financial analysis, but was present in a way that felt necessary, like an anchor in the room, and Clara stopped registering his presence as unusual after the first 30 minutes. Adrian moved between oversight and participation. He was not a financial expert, that was clear, but he was an exceptional strategic thinker, the kind who could hold a large, complex picture in his mind and immediately identify which pieces were load-bearing. When Clara explained something he didn't fully understand, he asked a single precise question, rather than requesting a general re-explanation, which told her he already had the context and simply needed one piece of it clarified. By the time they broke at 10:15, they had built a map of the full operation. Not just what she had known before. The whole picture crosses information layered over her original investigation. The offshore structures, and the insider leak, and the storage facility that Serena had confirmed was still active under Rourke's subsidiary. The facility is the key, Clara said. They had been over this twice, and she wanted it clearly established. If those records are there, they corroborate Cross's account and they corroborate my original investigation. With both, you have something that can't be dismissed. We'll access it tonight, Adrian said. Clara looked at him. I want to be there. He met her eyes. That's not... I know the documents, she said. I built the original case around them. I know what's significant and what isn't. And I can identify relevant materials in a fraction of the time it would take someone working from my notes. She held his gaze. And I told you I wanted results. This is part of the results. I was the one they tried to destroy. I want to be there when we find what they used to do it. A silence. Marcus near the window did not move, but somehow seemed more present. Adrian said, You'll stay back from anything operational. If I tell you to move, you move. Agreed. And you understand that what happens tonight does not go in any report you file. I'm not filing reports anymore, she said. Remember? He looked at her steadily. That might change, he said. When this is over, you should think about what you want the legal record to look like. She thought about it. I want the truth in the legal record, she said. I don't care how it got there. The storage facility was in Queens, in an industrial area that was mostly quiet after 7 p.m. Clara sat in the back of a car with Adrian and Serena, while 2 other people, she still did not know how many total were involved in this, confirmed the structure of the facility from the outside. She had changed out of the clothes she'd met them in into something more practical, dark and quiet, and she felt the adrenaline of the situation as a low, steady current rather than a spike, which was how she had always experienced high-stakes moments. Rourke's subsidiary has a dedicated section, Serena said, looking at her laptop screen. 3rd floor Eastern Corridor. The contract specifies climate-controlled archival storage, long-term retention. He kept everything, Clara said, including things he absolutely should have destroyed. Serena agreed. Adrian's phone buzzed. He read something on it and said, "We're clear." The next 40 minutes were the most consequential of Clara's professional life, which was saying something given the previous 6 years. She found the documentation in the second storage unit they opened. It was organized the way she had predicted. Rourke was meticulous. His filing system was elaborate and logical. And once she understood the organizational structure, she could move through it quickly. The original fabricated documents were there, the correspondence that had accompanied them, the internal communications between Rourke and 2 of the other men discussing the strategy for deploying them. And at the back of the 4th file drawer in a manila envelope that was labeled with a date 3 years before her investigation had begun, Clara found something she had not expected. Evidence of a prior operation. The same 8 men. Different target, a different investigator, a man named Paul Channing, who had worked for a federal oversight body and whose career had ended abruptly and mysteriously 7 years ago, officially attributed to health reasons. She held the envelope and felt the weight of it. This was not the first time. She turned to Adrian, who was standing 2 steps away watching her. "They've done this before," she said. Her voice was even. She was very, very calm. "There was someone before me, a federal investigator. They destroyed him the same way." Adrian looked at the envelope. "I suspected there might be prior instances." "You suspected? People who develop effective methods of self-protection don't develop them in response to a single threat," he said. "They develop them over time through use." Clara thought about Paul Channing, whose name she had never known, who had been destroyed, and then disappeared from the professional landscape, and who had been doing the same thing she had been doing, uncovering the same people, and who had failed for the same reason. She thought about the fact that if it hadn't stopped, then it wouldn't have stopped with her. They would have done it to someone else. Eventually, they would have done it to someone else. "This changes the scope," she said. "Yes," Adrian said. "This isn't just my case anymore. If there's a prior instance, there are grounds for a broader investigation. Federal jurisdiction potentially. Multiple victims, multiple instances of the same pattern." "Yes," he said again. She looked at him. "You knew this might be here." "I thought it was possible," he said carefully. "And you wanted me here when we found it," she said. "Not just to identify the documents, because you knew what it would mean to me, to find out it went back further." He held her gaze. "I thought you should see it for yourself, not read it in a summary." Clara held the envelope for another moment. Then she set it carefully with the other materials Serena was photographing and cataloging with systematic precision. "He survived," she said. "Channing. Is he—" "Alive," Adrian said. "He runs a small accounting firm in Vermont. He has not spoken publicly about what happened to him." "He might now," she said. "With this." "He might," Adrian agreed. They finished at the storage facility at 1:40 a.m. Clara was back in her apartment by 2:30, exhausted, in a way that went through muscle and bone, all the way down to something she could not name, the exhaustion of having carried something heavy for 6 months, and having just been shown for the first time that the weight might actually be liftable. Her phone buzzed at 2:47 a.m. A news alert. Executive Dennis Rourke named in financial misconduct investigation following anonymous document release. She read the article with both hands wrapped around a glass of water because her coffee maker was out of beans and she had not slept in 42 hours, and the details didn't matter. What mattered was the headline. Rourke, the man who had built the false evidence against her. The man whose gray face she had watched at the Whitmore Grand as he walked past her toward the side exit, already receiving the first of whatever was coming for him. Now he was receiving the rest of it. She set the water glass down. She thought about 6 remaining men who had woken up this morning believing they were untouchable and would go to bed tonight knowing that something was hunting them through the structures they had built to protect themselves. She thought about Richard and about Paul Channing in Vermont, and about 312 workers, and about the original document she had filed 11 months ago before everything came apart. She thought about the word results and the choice she had made in a 34th floor office earlier in the day. She opened her laptop. She typed 2 names into the search bar. Paul Channing, Vermont. There were 4 accounting firms registered in Vermont under variations of that name. She started with the first one. She was not going to wait for morning. Paul Channing answered on the 3rd call, not the 3rd accounting firm. The 3rd attempt to reach him directly after Clara had identified the right firm, found a general contact number, and called twice with no answer. The 2nd call had gone to voicemail, and she had not left a message. She had called again at 3:15 in the morning, because she was past the point where normal social hours meant anything to her, and because she believed correctly, as it turned out, that a man who had been through what Paul Channing had been through would not be sleeping peacefully at 3 a.m. any more than she was. He picked up on the 2nd ring of the 3rd call. "Who is this?" His voice was alert, not groggy. She had been right about the sleeping. "My name is Clara Bennett," she said. "I'm a financial investigator. Or I was. I worked out of New York. I found your name tonight in a storage facility in Queens, in a file that was 7 years old in the records of a man named Dennis Rourke." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. "You need to tell me how you accessed those records," he said. His voice had changed. The alertness sharpened into something more guarded, more precise. He had a voice like someone who chose every word carefully because he had once said the wrong ones and understood the cost. "I was part of an operation that went into the facility tonight," she said. "There's a longer explanation for what that means, and I'll give it to you. But I need you to know first what I found. There was an envelope in the 4th file drawer of Rourke's 3rd storage unit. It had your name in the internal correspondence. It documented what they did to you. The same pattern they used 7 years ago. They refined it and used it again on me 11 months ago." Another silence. Longer this time. "They destroyed your investigation," he said, not a question. "They destroyed my career," she said, "and my mentor. He died 8 weeks after." She heard him breathe, slow and controlled the breath of someone managing something large. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "About your mentor." His name was Richard Aldridge. A pause. "I didn't know him personally, but I knew of him. He was good. He was the best I ever worked with," she said. "And they killed him as thoroughly as if they'd used a weapon, just more slowly." She stopped. She had not meant to say it exactly that way. But at 3:15 in the morning, after 40-something hours without sleep, the filters were thinner. "Mr. Channing Paul, I need to know what happened to you. Everything. Not the official version. What actually happened." He was quiet for so long, she thought he might hang up. Then he said, "Where are you right now?" "My apartment, New York." "And the people you were with tonight, in the facility?" "Not law enforcement," she said. "Not a firm. Someone with resources who has a specific interest in holding these 8 men accountable." "Someone," he repeated carefully. "Someone who has already moved on 2 of the 8 since last night," she said. "Cross is cooperating. Rourke is under investigation as of 2 hours ago based on documents from that facility." The silence this time was different. She could feel him calculating through it, the same kind of calculation she had watched herself make over the past 20 hours. The weighing of what was possible against what was safe, against what you could not keep carrying alone. "You said you found an envelope," he said finally. "In the 4th drawer." "Yes. Manila, no label on the outside except the date." "Yes. I prepared that envelope," he said. "I put those materials there myself, 7 years ago, before they finished destroying what I had built." A pause. "I broke into the facility. I had the access codes from an earlier visit and I copied them. I put everything I had, everything they hadn't managed to erase, into that envelope, and I filed it where I knew Rourke kept things and where I thought it might survive, where he would never look because it was in his own storage." Another pause. "I told myself someone would find it eventually." Clara felt something move through her that she did not have an immediate word for. Recognition partly. And grief, because the image of Paul Channing doing what she herself would have done, finding the one place to hide something, So it survived, even if he didn't, was close enough to her own experience to hurt. It survived, she said. We have it. He exhaled. Tell me everything, she said again. And this time, he did. He talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Clara took notes, not because she needed to. Her memory was precise, always had been, but because writing helped her organize what she was hearing into the architecture she would need later. Paul Channing had been 33 when his investigation began. He had been working for a federal oversight body, which gave him tools she had not had, but also made him a more visible target. The 8 men had moved faster on him than they had on her. Perhaps because the federal angle alarmed them more. Perhaps because they were less practiced in those earlier years. The method had been cruder, not the elaborate false evidence construction that Rourke had refined by the time they came for her, but effective enough. They had gotten to his supervisor directly. They had created enough doubt to stall the investigation, then kill it, then quietly remove Channing from his position through a series of administrative moves that looked like routine personnel decisions. He had fought for 2 years. Then he had stopped fighting not because he gave up, but because he ran out of resources, and the damage to his health had been real and significant in ways he described with the spare matter-of-fact language of someone who had made peace with a difficult chapter. He had moved to Vermont. He had rebuilt a small, quiet professional life. He had not spoken publicly about what happened because he believed accurately. She thought that speaking publicly without evidence would only expose him to further damage without accomplishing anything. But you kept the documentation, she said. I couldn't prove anything with it, he said. Not on my own, not in the state I was in. A pause. I kept it because I couldn't make myself destroy it. I kept it because I wanted there to be a record somewhere, even if nobody ever found it. People are going to find it now, she said. Everything, all of it. What they did to you, what they did to me, what they did to 312 workers whose names I have in a file on my computer. You have the workers' names, all of them, she said. I spent the first 3 months of my investigation identifying every individual impacted by the companies they destroyed. It's part of my record. She paused. Richard taught me that. He said the numbers were the map, but the people were the reason. Paul Channing was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality than it had at the beginning of the call. Not softer exactly, more open. What do you need from me? He said. A formal statement, she said. On record. Your account of what happened 7 years ago corroborated by the materials we found tonight. Alongside my account and Cross's cooperation, it establishes a pattern. It makes this about more than one case. As soon as you're willing, she said. Today, if possible. A pause. She could hear him thinking. She recognized the specific quality of silence that came before a person made a decision they had been approaching for a long time. I'll come to New York, he said. I'll take the first train I can get. She thanked him and ended the call and sat in the quiet of her apartment at nearly 5 a.m. with the notes she had taken and the weight of what was building. She slept for 3 hours, not peacefully, but enough. She woke to 4 missed calls and a text from Adrian. The text said, "We need to meet. Something has changed." The something that had changed was Marcus Hale. Clara learned this in Adrian's office, not the neutral midtown suite from the previous day, but a different space higher up with the feel of somewhere he actually worked, which was organized and spare and contained significantly more information than the furniture suggested. Serena was already there when Clara arrived at 9:30. Marcus, the other. Marcus, the quiet one who stood by windows, was not present, which Clara noted without commenting on. Adrian said, Hale moved last night. Approximately 3 hours after the Rourke story broke, he made contact with 2 individuals in the remaining 6. He's organizing. Organizing what? Clara asked, though she had already begun constructing the answer. A counter-narrative, Serena said from the laptop. He's been on the phone with a crisis communications firm since 6 this morning. He's also made calls to 2 journalists he has existing relationships with. She looked up. He's going to try to get ahead of the story. By doing what? Clara asked. By reframing it, Adrian said, positioning himself as a victim of a coordinated extortion attempt. Using Cross's disappearance as the frame, a powerful man targeted by criminal elements with the investigation into Rourke presented as fabricated evidence planted as part of the scheme. Clara felt the cold recognition of a familiar tactic. He's going to say the evidence was manufactured. Specifically, Adrian said he's going to say it was manufactured by someone attempting to extort the group, and he's going to name a person as the source of the extortion. The way he said it, the careful, measured way with that slight pause before the final clause, told her before he confirmed it. Me, she said. You, he said. She sat back in her chair. In the specific crystalline way that anger sometimes arrived when it was fully justified, she felt it land and settle. Not hot, cold. The kind of cold that was useful. He's going to say I've been running a scheme, she said. That I fabricated the investigation originally, that I was removed for misconduct, that I've been trying to extort them since, and that this— she gestured broadly at everything happening around them— is my attempt to coerce them through manufactured evidence and criminal associates. That's a reasonable summary of what he appears to be preparing, Adrian said. And me being connected to you, she said, to someone whose name appears in certain research contexts. That will be central to his argument, yes, Adrian said. He's going to present you as a disgraced investigator who allied herself with organized criminal interests to wage a personal vendetta, which is, she said with a precision she held on to deliberately, not entirely inaccurate as a description of the surface-level facts stripped of every contextual element that makes them what they actually are. Adrian met her eyes. He did not argue with this. She appreciated that. What does this change? She asked. It changes the timeline, Adrian said. And it changes your exposure. Right now, you're inside this operation in a way that could be used against you if Hale constructs the narrative first. If his story reaches certain journalists and certain authorities before we've established the full evidentiary record. I become the story instead of them, she said. Yes. Clara thought about this for exactly as long as it deserved, which was about 30 seconds. She thought about Paul Channing on a train from Vermont. She thought about the 4 file drawers of documentation in Queens. She thought about 11 pages of notes and the 312 names. Then we need to establish the record first, she said, today. That's what I believe, Adrian said. I have Paul Channing coming, she said. He's a prior victim, 7 years before me. Same pattern, same men, same methods. His testimony alongside mine and Cross's cooperation gives you 3 sources. Something moved in Adrian's expression. Channing is coming here. I called him last night, she said, at 3 a.m. A pause. He prepared that envelope himself. He broke into the storage facility 7 years ago and hid his own documentation in Rourke's records because it was the only place he thought it would survive. Adrian looked at her steadily. You called him at 3 a.m. I wasn't sleeping. I know, he said. I mean— He stopped. The stop was unusual for him. He did not often begin sentences he didn't finish. That was good instinct, he said. Having him here strengthens everything. That's why I did it, she said. But she was aware as she said it that it was not the only reason. She had called Paul Channing at 3 a.m, partly because she recognized in what had happened to him something that had happened to her, and the impulse to reach toward that recognition had been real and human and not entirely strategic. Adrian's phone rang. He looked at it, then at Clara. I need to take this. He stepped out. Serena looked up from her laptop. He found you interesting before the ballroom, she said without preamble. Clara looked at her. What? He researched you before the Whitmore event, Serena said. Her tone was informational, rather than personal, the tone of someone reporting a fact that seemed relevant. Your investigation was on his radar because 2 of the 8 men have interests that overlap with operations he monitors. He saw your name in connection with it 6 weeks before the ball. He went because he expected to encounter them there. She paused. He didn't expect you. Clara processed this. He researched me 6 weeks ago. He read everything publicly available about your investigation and its collapse, Serena said. And I'd describe it as troubled by it. He doesn't use that word, but I've worked with him for 6 years, and I know what troubled looks like on him. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked. Serena considered the question with what appeared to be genuine deliberation. Because what's coming next is going to require you to trust him at a level that's going to feel uncomfortable, she said. And because I think you're the kind of person who makes better decisions when you have complete information. She looked back at her screen. Also because it's true and relevant, and I don't believe in withholding relevant information. Neither do I, Clara said. I know, Serena said. I read your investigation file. Adrian returned 7 minutes later. His expression had shifted in a way Clara was becoming better at reading. Whatever the call had contained had altered something. Gerald Whitfield, he said. Clara straightened. Whitfield, the insurance executive, the one who had gone to her supervisor with the fabricated misconduct account. 65 years old, the calmest of the 8 in her assessment, the one who had seemed most comfortable with what they were doing. What about him? She asked. He's left the country, Adrian said. As of this morning, his passport was used at JFK at 6:47 a.m. He's on a flight to Geneva. The room absorbed this. He's running, Clara said. He is, Adrian said, which tells us 2 things. First, that he did not coordinate his movement with Hale, which means the 8 are not operating as a unified group anymore. They're fragmenting. He paused. Second, that he knows significantly more than the others about what's coming. Whitfield is the most cautious of the group. He doesn't move until he understands the full threat. He knows about the storage facility, Clara said. Almost certainly, Adrian said. She thought about it. He has contacts in Switzerland, insurance connections. He could be moving assets. Serena, Adrian said. Already on it, Serena said without looking up. The fragmentation helps us, Clara said. If they're not coordinating, Hale's counter-narrative loses 2 sources. Cross is cooperating against them, Whitfield is gone. He needs the remaining 5 to hold. If any of them break. 2 already have, Adrian said. Since this morning. Clara stared at him. Which 2? Alan Mercer and David Foss. 2 of the 8 she knew well. Mercer was a fund manager. Foss was a corporate attorney who had provided the legal architecture for the shell companies. Mercer reached out through an intermediary at 7 this morning requesting a conversation. Foss contacted his own attorney at 8 and began preliminary discussions about cooperation with authorities. Authorities, she said. Actual legal authorities. The evidence from the storage facility was delivered anonymously to the U.S. Attorney's Office at 6 this morning, Adrian said. She had not known this. She absorbed it. You moved last night, she said. Before we even finished. Before we left the facility, he said. Serena transmitted the documentation while we were still there. She thought about the timeline. The Rourke story, breaking publicly at 2:47 a.m. The anonymous delivery to the U.S. Attorney's Office before that. The sequence was deliberate, established the legal record before the public story so that when Hale's people tried to frame it as fabrication, there were already federal eyes on the materials. You were always going to do this through legal channels, she said. It was not quite an accusation, more like a recognition. I told you I was dismantling them, not harming them, Adrian said. Dismantling means making what they built impossible to sustain. That requires legal accountability, not just pressure. Then what was Cross? She asked. What was that night with him, wherever you kept him? The question was direct, and she watched him decide how to answer it. Cross needed to understand the full scope of what we had before he was willing to cooperate, Adrian said. He needed to understand that the materials we possessed made his current position untenable. That conversation required a degree of privacy that a standard office meeting could not provide. But he was not physically harmed. He was not physically harmed, Adrian said. He was persuaded, comprehensively. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the line she had crossed and where exactly it was, and whether what he was describing was on the same side of it she was on or a different one. She decided to continue, not because she had resolved the question, because the work in front of them was too important to stop now. And because stopping now with Hale mobilizing a counter-narrative and Whitfield in the air over the Atlantic and Paul Channing on a train from Vermont, stopping now was not something she was willing to do. "What do we need before Hale's people get to the journalists?" she asked. "A statement from you," Adrian said. "On record. Your account of the original investigation, the collapse, the evidence you've recovered, and Channing's corroboration." "I need an attorney present for that," she said. "Not because I'm afraid of what I'm saying, because anything I put on record needs to be legally clean." "I have one," Adrian said. "She'll be here in 20 minutes. You have an attorney on call at 9:30 in the morning." "I have several," he said, "on call at various hours." Of course he did. The attorney, a woman named Catherine Voss, who was somewhere between 50 and 60, and who had the particular contained energy of someone who had been in high-pressure rooms so many times that pressure had become simply the ambient condition of her professional life. Arrived in 18 minutes and spent 4 with Clara before the session began, which was enough for Clara to understand that Catherine Voss was the real thing. She was not there to protect Adrian's interests at Clara's expense. She was there to ensure that what Clara was about to say was protected, documented correctly, and impervious to the kind of attack Hale was building. "You understand," Catherine said, "that this statement, once made, may be used in federal proceedings." "That's why I'm making it," Clara said. "And you understand that portions of what you describe regarding how the evidence was recovered may raise questions about the means of acquisition." "The storage facility had my documentation in it," Clara said. "Documentation that was created in the process of building a false case against me. I'd argue I had a reasonable proprietary interest in recovering it." Catherine looked at her steadily. "That's not a legal standard." "No," Clara agreed. "But it's a starting position, and the materials themselves are what matters. The U.S. Attorney's Office has them now. What they do with them is a legal process. My statement is about the original investigation and the pattern." Catherine nodded. "Then let's begin." Paul Channing arrived at 2:14 in the afternoon, having taken the early Amtrak and a car from Penn Station. He was in his early 50s, gray at the temples, with the posture of a man who had been under significant weight for a long time and had learned to carry it without letting it show in his shoulders. He was not what Clara had pictured, and then she realized she hadn't pictured anything. She had been too focused on the information he carried to construct a person around it. He shook her hand and held it a moment longer than a standard handshake. "Thank you for calling," he said. "Thank you for answering," she said. They sat together for an hour before his formal statement with Catherine Voss, because Clara believed correctly that the most important thing was for him to feel the completeness of what had been found. She showed him the photographs of the envelope, the internal correspondence, the documentation he had assembled 7 years ago and filed in a place where he believed someone might eventually find it. He looked at the photographs for a long time. "I thought sometimes that I imagined doing it," he said. "It was a strange night. I wasn't well. The whole thing felt like something happening to someone else." He looked up from the photographs. "But I had to do something. I needed there to be a record." "There is one," she said. "There has been for 7 years. We just found it." He looked at her. "Your mentor, Richard, he believed this too, that the truth would—" "He believed the numbers were the map," she said, "and that the map always led somewhere eventually if you followed it." Paul Channing nodded slowly. "He was right," he said. "It just took 7 years." "And 11 months," she said. "And a man in a ballroom who noticed your smile," he said carefully, looking at her with a directness that told her he had pieced more together from the conversation than she had explicitly said. She met his gaze. "And that," she said. The afternoon moved fast. Paul's statement was recorded with Catherine present. Adrian was in and out of the office. There were phone calls. There were people coming and going that Clara was not introduced to. There was the constant layered activity of something large and complicated being operated at speed. At 4:30, Serena showed Clara a breaking news alert on her laptop. Federal authorities have confirmed receipt of materials related to an ongoing investigation into financial misconduct by a group of New York-based executives. A spokesperson declined to name specific individuals, but confirmed the investigation is active. The investigation is active. Clara read it 3 times. The U.S. Attorney's Office had not sat on the materials. They had moved within hours, which meant the materials were compelling enough, and the prior political calculation around the case had shifted enough that the institutional paralysis she had encountered 11 months ago was no longer the obstacle it had been. "Why is it different now?" she said. 11 months ago they buried this. Why are they moving now? Serena and Adrian exchanged one of their wordless exchanges. "What?" Clara said. Because 11 months ago, Adrian said, the political calculation included certain relationships between the U.S. Attorney's Office and 2 of the 8 men that have recently become considerably more complicated. She stared at him. "You moved on someone inside the office." "I provided information to a journalist," he said carefully, "about a relationship between a senior staff member and one of the 8 that constituted a conflict of interest. That information was published this morning." She had not seen it. She pulled it up. A legal affairs newsletter, not major media, but widely read in the right circles, had published a piece about the conflict of interest that morning at 7 a.m. before the Rourke story. Before the anonymous delivery to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The sequence was breathtaking in its precision. Clear the internal obstacle first, then deliver the materials. Then let the public story break. "You mapped this entire sequence before last night," she said. "Before the ballroom," he said. "Before we spoke." "I told you," he said. "I'd been considering it for a while. Your investigation was already on my radar. The ballroom simply—" He stopped. "Accelerated things," she said, using his own word from the night before. "Yes," he said. She looked at him across the organized spare surface of his working office. This man who had spent 3 days mapping the precise sequence by which 8 powerful men would be dismantled, who had cleared political obstacles at 7 in the morning and moved on legal channels by 6, who had said, "I spent years believing fear was the only language powerful people understood," in a way that suggested this was no longer his only method. "What changed?" she asked. Fear was the only language. What changed? He met her eyes. The question was personal, and they both knew it. "I met someone once," he said, "who built something legitimate, after years of operating the way I operated. He built something clean and real, and the same kind of people your 8 men are destroyed. It for exactly the same reasons they destroy everything, because it threatened them. And I watched that happen and did nothing because I told myself it wasn't my concern, and my methods didn't include—" He stopped, looked away briefly. "I should have done something then. I didn't." "Who was it?" she asked. "Someone who didn't deserve what happened to him," Adrian said. "Someone I could have protected." She thought about what Serena had told her that morning. Troubled. 6 weeks ago. Long before the ballroom. She thought about Richard. "I'm sorry," she said. And then, because she meant it to be more than a social formula, losing someone you could have protected is a specific kind of weight. Adrian looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not vulnerability. She was not sure he had a conventional version of that, but something underneath the composure that was real and unguarded in a way the rest of him was not. "Yes," he said simply. "It is." The moment lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not 1 second longer, because Serena said, "Hale is going public," without preamble, and everything in the room shifted back to speed. The statement Marcus Hale released at 4:52 p.m. was not what Clara had expected, which was to say it was worse. It was polished, emotionally calibrated. It named her directly, Clara Bennett, disgraced former investigator connection to known criminal interests, and it was constructed with the specific, devastating skill of someone who had been doing this for decades and understood exactly which elements would resonate with which audiences. It did not make wild claims. It made measured ones. It expressed concern. It invited scrutiny. It positioned Hale as a man who had built legitimate enterprises over 40 years and was now the target of a coordinated criminal scheme driven by personal vendetta. It was, Clara thought, reading it on Serena's screen, the best version of a lie she had ever encountered. And she had encountered exceptional ones. "He got his story out first," she said. "He got a version of it out," Adrian said. "Not the same thing." "It's going to stick with some people," she said. "My name is in this. My connection to you. The narrative writes itself destroyed investigator criminal alliance revenge scheme. Some portion of the public is going to believe it regardless of what comes out later." "Yes," Adrian said. He did not soften it or argue with it. She appreciated that, even as she hated the thing itself. "Then what do we do?" she asked. "We tell the truth faster than he tells the lie," Adrian said. "Channing's statement goes to 3 specific journalists tonight. People who have covered financial misconduct for decades and who have the context to understand what it represents. Your statement follows through, Catherine. The federal investigation leak from this afternoon is already generating follow-up inquiries from major outlets. By morning, there will be competing narratives." "Competing isn't winning," she said. "Not yet," he agreed. "But winning requires the truth to be present in the conversation. Right now it isn't. By morning it will be." Clara looked at the statement on the screen. At her name in the 3rd paragraph, stripped of every context, every fact, every human reality that made it what it actually was. She thought about the performance she had worn to the Whitmore Grand 4 days ago. The practiced smile, the perfectly calibrated neutral expression, and how she had worn it because she refused to let them define what she looked like. They were doing it again. Trying to define what she looked like. She was not going to perform this time. "I want to go on record publicly," she said. "Not just a statement through an attorney. I want to respond directly to Hale's statement. My name, my account, my voice." Adrian looked at her carefully. "That carries risk." "He already named me," she said. "I'm already in the story. The only question is whether I'm in it as the person he described or as the person I actually am." She looked at him steadily. "You said winning requires the truth to be present. I'm the truth. Let me be present." A pause. He held her gaze with that focused, assessing quality that she now recognized as his version of serious consideration. "Catherine needs to clear whatever you say," he said. "Of course. And you understand that once you go public, you're not inside this operation quietly anymore. Your name and this investigation are permanently linked." "My name was linked to this investigation 11 months ago," she said. "They just made sure it was linked to the wrong version of it." She paused. "It's time to link it to the right one." Something in Adrian's expression changed again. That movement she was learning to read, that small shift beneath the composure that represented what he actually felt, rather than what he was presenting. He said, "Catherine." And Catherine Voss, who had been reviewing documents at the other end of the table, looked up and said, "I heard. Give me 40 minutes to prepare the framework and I'll make sure whatever she says is legally sound." Clara spent those 40 minutes with Paul Channing, who was going to add his voice as well, because once Clara had made her decision, he had sat quietly for approximately 3 minutes and then said that he had been quiet for 7 years, and he was finished being quiet. They sat together, these two people who had been destroyed by the same machine 7 years apart, and they talked about what they were going to say, and Clara thought about the fact that the thing she was most afraid of right now was not Hale, or the counter-narrative, or the exposure. The thing she was most afraid of was the possibility that it would be enough. That the truth would be present, and it still wouldn't be sufficient. That the structures of money and influence that had protected these 8 men for 7 years, plus 11 months, would find another way to absorb the impact and continue. She had been afraid of that for 6 months. She was still afraid of it now. But she was going to say what she had to say anyway. Because the alternative was silence, and she had decided on the night of the Whitmore ball, standing in an emerald green dress with $11 in her account and a practiced smile, and her grip tightening on a champagne glass, she had decided that silence was no longer something she was willing to give them. Not one more day of it. Not one more hour. At 7:15 p.m., 4 days after a stranger at a charity ball had asked who killed your smile, Clara Bennett gave her first public statement. Her voice was steady, her face was her own, and she did not perform a single thing. The statement ran 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Clara had not written it out word for word. Catherine Voss had advised against that scripted statements read like scripted statements. And the last thing Clara needed was to sound like a legal document, when what she was a person. So Clara had prepared the shape of it. The architecture, the 3 things she needed to establish in sequence, what she had found 11 months ago, what had been done to her in response, and what had been recovered in the past 4 days. She did not mention Adrian by name. She did not describe the storage facility in terms that raised acquisition questions. She named the 8 men directly and without qualification, because Catherine had told her that the public record already contained enough for that to be defensible, and because Clara had decided that careful language was no longer something she owed people who had not been careful with her life. She mentioned Richard Aldridge. She said his full name clearly, slowly, in a way that made it real rather than a supporting detail. And she said near the end something she had not prepared and had not told Catherine she was going to say. She said, "I am not the first person these men destroyed. I found evidence of a prior victim, a federal investigator who lost everything 7 years before I did. His name is Paul Channing. He prepared the documentation that survived. He preserved it when they took everything else from him. And he is here with me today." Paul, who had been standing 3 feet to her left and outside the frame of the camera, Clara's phone was propped against, closed his eyes briefly when she said his name, then opened them, then stepped into frame. He said 5 sentences. He said them quietly and without performance, the way a man spoke who had waited 7 years to say something true out loud. He confirmed his name, his prior position, what had happened to him. He said that what had been done to Clara Bennett was the same thing done by the same people, refined with more practice. And he said that the documentation he had preserved for 7 years had been found and was now in the hands of federal investigators. 5 sentences. They were enough. Clara posted the video at 7:15 p.m. on 3 platforms simultaneously. She had accounts she had not used in 6 months, and she used them now. By 7:30, it had been viewed 14,000 times. By 8, a major financial news outlet had embedded it in a breaking story. By 8:45, it was the most shared item on 2 journalism platforms that covered financial regulation. By 9 o'clock, Marcus Hale's counter-narrative, which had led certain news cycles for 4 hours, had been functionally buried. Not gone, not forgotten, but buried under the specific weight of 2 real people with real names saying real things on camera. Clara watched the numbers climb from Adrian's office, sitting in a chair that was more comfortable than it looked, holding a cup of coffee that was actually hot for the first time in days. She felt something she could not immediately name, and then identified as stillness. Not peace, too much was still in motion for peace, but the particular earned stillness of a person who has done exactly what they could do and is waiting to see what the world does with it, Serena said without looking up from her screen. Hale's crisis communications firm just dropped him as a client. Clara looked up. Already, they posted a statement saying they don't represent clients who are subjects of active federal investigations. Serena's tone carried the informational quality it always did, stripped of commentary. But there was something in the speed of her delivery that suggested she found this development satisfying. They cited the U.S. Attorney's confirmation from this afternoon. "He's exposed," Clara said. "He's exposed," Serena confirmed. "And the remaining men who were holding know it." Adrian said, "Mercer formally retained a cooperation attorney at 8:30. "That's 3, Clara said. "Cross Mercer Foss." She did a fast mental accounting. Whitfield is in Geneva. Rourke is under investigation. Hale is the last one standing as a public advocate for their position. She paused. "Who are the remaining 2? "Vincent Shaw and Thomas Alcott," Adrian said. She knew them. Shaw was a hedge fund partner, 55, methodical, risk-averse by professional instinct. Alcott was the quietest of the eight, a corporate governance consultant whose role in the original scheme had been to provide the institutional credibility that made the false misconduct narrative against her look legitimate. He had written the report recommending her removal. 3 pages. Calm language. Devastating. "Shaw will read the room," she said. "He's always reading the room. When he calculates that holding is worse than cooperating, he'll flip. Alcott is different." She thought about the 3-page report. The calm language. Alcott is the one who believes he was doing the right thing. Adrian looked at her. "Explain." "He's not a cynical man," she said. "He's a man who convinced himself that I was genuinely corrupt, that the narrative they built about me was true. He's been carrying this for 11 months without the cognitive dissonance that the others feel, because he never admitted to himself that he was lying." She paused. "He's going to be the hardest to crack. And if he holds publicly, he gives Hale's remaining credibility a structure to hang on." "You understand him well," Adrian said. "I spent 3 weeks on his professional history during my original investigation," she said. "He's not malicious. He's something more dangerous. He's someone who can do a terrible thing and walk away clean inside himself because he found a way to believe it was justified." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression was attentive in a way she was beginning to recognize as the particular attention he gave to things that were about more than the immediate situation. "That's the most dangerous kind of person in these situations," he said. "I know," she said. "I've had 11 months to think about it." She set down her coffee. "I need to talk to him." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happened when Adrian was deciding something quickly and did not want to display the speed of the decision. "That's not," he began. "I know it's not standard," she said. "But I'm the only person in this room who has read his full professional record, who understands what he was trying to protect when he wrote that report, and who can speak to him about it in a way that doesn't confirm his narrative about criminal pressure." She met Adrian's eyes steadily. "If you send anyone else, you're proving his version right. If I go alone through legitimate means, no pressure, I'm giving him the chance to see what he actually did." Another pause. "He may not want to see it," Adrian said. "Then I'll have tried," she said. "And we'll know it's not possible through that channel." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face that she had started to understand better. Not calculation, not exactly, but the process of someone who was used to controlling all variables encountering the particular challenge of a variable who made her own decisions. "Catherine goes with you," he said. "Agreed. And you contact me before you enter and the moment you leave." "Agreed. And if he tries to record the conversation?" "He will try to record the conversation," she said. "I'll begin by stating that I'm aware the conversation may be recorded and that everything I say is for the record. That removes the covert advantage." He studied her. "You've done this before." "I was an investigator for 6 years," she said. "Difficult conversations were part of the job. Not conversations like this one." "No," she admitted. "Not conversations like this one." Thomas Alcott lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn that Clara had known the address of for 11 months without ever having reason to go there. She and Catherine arrived at 10:15 in the evening, which was late enough that Alcott had clearly been at home for several hours, and early enough that the choice to answer the door was still his. He answered it himself. He was 61, shorter than she had imagined from photographs with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the slightly disrupted look of someone who had been consuming news about himself for several hours and had not found the experience comfortable. He recognized her immediately. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in about 2 seconds: surprise, calculation, and something that landed closer to dread than anything else. "Ms. Bennett," he said. "Mr. Alcott," she said. "I'd like to talk to you. I want to be clear that this conversation is not coercive. You don't have to open the door. If you do open it, you're free to end the conversation at any time. I'm not here to make threats or demands. I'm here because I believe you deserve the chance to understand what I know and decide what you want to do with that understanding." She paused. "This is Catherine Voss. She's an attorney. She's here to ensure this conversation is legally appropriate. Alcott looked at Catherine, then back at Clara. He was a man accustomed to assessing situations quickly. It was his professional function, and she watched him assess this one. He stepped back and opened the door. They sat in his living room. He did not offer them anything. She had not expected him to. "I assume you're aware of what happened today," Clara said. "I've been watching it for 6 hours," he said. His voice was controlled. He was frightened, but he was not going to show it more than he had to. "Then you know about the storage facility," she said, "and Cross's cooperation, and Paul Channing." "I know what's being reported," he said carefully. "I was there," she said. "In that facility. I found Rourke's files. I found the original fabricated documentation and the correspondence that accompanied it." She looked at him directly. "And I found your 3-page report. The misconduct recommendation. The one that went to my supervisor." He was very still. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to think about your actual answer, not the one that protects your position." She leaned forward slightly. "When you wrote that report, did you believe it?" He looked at her. His jaw tightened. "I had information," he said carefully. "Information that came from Hale." "From multiple sources. Sources that Hale controlled," she said. "I'm not asking whether you believed the sources were credible. I'm asking whether you believed I had done what the report said I did." She held his gaze. "Did you believe I was corrupt?" The silence lasted long enough to be an answer in itself. "I believed," he said finally slowly, "that the investigation had procedural problems, that there were serious questions about Thomas." She used his first name without planning to, and the effect was immediate. His controlled expression cracked slightly at the edges. "I've read your record. 22 years of corporate governance work. You've built your reputation on procedural integrity. When you wrote that report, you knew what your words would do to my career. You knew the weight they carried, and you wrote them anyway." She paused. "I need to know if you knew at the time that what you were writing was not the truth." Another long silence. "The information I was given," he said, "was presented as credible." "That's not what I asked." He looked away, looked back. And in his face finally, she saw what she had known was there, not the clean conscience of a man who had genuinely believed he was doing the right thing, but something fractured, something that had been fracturing for 11 months, in the privacy of a man who told himself he had done his job correctly, and had spent every month since finding reasons to keep believing it. "There were things," he said quietly, "that I should have verified independently, that I told myself didn't require verification because the source was—" He stopped. "Credible," she said. "Trusted," he said. The word came out differently than credible had, heavier. He meant Hale. Hale, who had provided him the information. Hale, who was now publicly abandoned by his own crisis communications firm and connected to a federal investigation. "Richard Aldridge is dead," Clara said. "Not as an attack, as a fact." She kept her voice even, and she did not allow it to become cruel, because cruelty was not what she was here for. "He died 8 weeks after that report went to my supervisor. He was 71 years old, and he had spent 40 years building a reputation for integrity. When the scandal broke, when your report and Rourke's fabricated documents and everything else combined to make the story look the way they wanted it to look, his name was attached to it. He went from being one of the most respected investigators in this city to being associated with corruption he had spent his entire career fighting." She looked at Alcott. "I held his hand while he died, and I watched him spend his last weeks knowing that the thing he had given his life to had been turned against him." She paused. "He didn't do anything wrong. Neither did I." Thomas Alcott's face, which had been controlled since the moment he opened the door, was no longer controlled. He was not crying. But the structure of his composure had given way to something that was looking very hard at what it had been built to conceal. "I have a daughter," he said. He said it seemingly without purpose, as though the words had arrived without a plan. "She's 27. She wants to go into compliance. Financial compliance. She's been telling me about it for 2 years. He looked at the table between them. She saw what happened to you. She mentioned it to me at the time. She said it was wrong, that the investigation should have been supported. Clara was quiet. I told her. He said that there were aspects of the situation she didn't have full information about. The specific excruciating quality of that a father lying to his daughter to protect himself from what he had done sat in the room between them. What did she say? Clara asked. He didn't answer for a moment. Then, she said she hoped I was right, because she wanted to believe that the system protected people like you. Clara sat with this. She thought about 27 years old, and wanting to go into financial compliance and hoping the system worked. She thought about herself at 27 with the same hopes and what 11 months and Richard's death had done to them. She said, "The system didn't protect me, but it can still do the right thing here, if the people who have information share it." She looked at him. "Your daughter is right that what happened to me was wrong. Help me make it mean something." The pause that followed was the longest of the evening. Then Thomas Alcott said, "I want to speak to Catherine." She gave them privacy. She stepped outside and called Adrian. "He's talking to Catherine," she said. A brief silence. "You got through to him." "I talked to him," she said. "He got through to himself." She stood in the cool evening air outside the brownstone, and the city moved around her in its ordinary way, and she felt the specific exhaustion of a person who had used everything they had and was now waiting to see if it was sufficient. "How?" Adrian asked. "His daughter," she said. "He has a 27-year-old who wants to go into financial compliance and who believed in what I was doing." She paused. "Sometimes the lever you need has nothing to do with the case." She heard him breathe. "Richard taught you that." "Richard taught me that," she agreed. She did not ask how he knew. He had read everything. She had understood that from the beginning. She waited for 35 minutes outside Alcott's building, listening to the city, not checking her phone, except once when a message from Serena told her that Vincent Shaw had formally retained a cooperation attorney at 10:45. 4. Hale, alone. When Catherine came out, her expression was professional and contained, but Clara knew from 6 years of reading people in high-stakes situations what professional and contained looked like when it was covering something significant. "He'll provide a statement," Catherine said. "A full one. He's going to confirm his role in preparing the report, confirm that the information he was given by Hale was presented without the verification he should have demanded, and confirm that he had doubts at the time that he did not act on." She paused. "He's also going to provide documentation of 3 other situations in which Hale used him in a similar capacity over the past 12 years. Clara stared at her. 12 years. "He was not always complicit knowingly," Catherine said. "In some of the earlier instances, he appears to have been genuinely deceived. But the pattern of Hale using his professional credibility to legitimize fabricated misconduct narratives that goes back further than your case or Channing's." "More victims," Clara said. "Potentially," Catherine said. "He's been maintaining records. He wasn't sure what to do with them. Tonight he decided." Clara looked at the door of the brownstone. She thought about a man who had spent 12 years being used and not looking too closely at how, and about the 27-year-old daughter who had said she hoped the system protected people like Clara, and about the specific way that the truth sometimes arrived, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a slow, private decision made in a room when someone finally ran out of reasons to keep avoiding it. "Okay," she said. "Let's go back." The night was not over. It was after midnight by the time Clara returned to Adrian's office, and the room had changed in texture. Fewer people, quieter. But the information on Serena's screen was moving faster than it had been. Clara absorbed the updates in order. Shaw had cooperated. Alcott was cooperating. Rourke's attorney had contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office, requesting a proffer session. Cross was still talking and had apparently expanded his account to include instances predating Clara's investigation by 4 years. and Whitfield in Geneva had made a mistake. He transferred assets, Serena said. This afternoon, shortly after his flight landed. He moved funds through 3 accounts and attempted to get them into a structure that would put them outside reach. She looked up. The accounts were being monitored. By whom? Clara asked. Swiss banking authorities, Serena said. Alerted by a tip this morning. Clara looked at Adrian. He said nothing. The tip this morning, she said. It was a busy morning, he said. You reported him to Swiss banking authorities before he landed. I provided information to certain contacts who were in a position to share it appropriately, he said. The asset movement confirmed the necessity of the alert. She absorbed this. The precision of it. Whitfield running, thinking he was ahead of everything, landing in Geneva, into a situation that had already been prepared for him. A man believing he had escaped walking into a room where the door had already closed. He's not going anywhere, she said. He has very limited options at the moment, Adrian agreed, which left Marcus Hale. What's Hale doing right now? She asked. His phone has been inactive for 90 minutes, Serena said. His last calls were to his personal attorney and to an unlisted number we haven't been able to identify. The unlisted number concerns me, Adrian said. Clara thought about Hale. 62 years old, the architect, the one who had seen her investigation coming and made the call to neutralize it before it could reach completion. The one who had organized the others the way a general organized assets efficiently, without sentiment, with a clear-eyed understanding of what was necessary. A man like that watching everything collapse would not go quietly. He would not sit with a glass of bourbon and accept what was happening. He would look for the one remaining move. What's the most dangerous thing he could do right now? She asked. The question was not rhetorical. She was thinking out loud, and she had learned that Adrian's thinking when they were doing it together produced results faster than either of them did separately. Go after the evidence directly, Adrian said. Not the materials, those are with the U.S. attorney, and we have copies of everything. But the witnesses. He looked at her. Cross is in a controlled location. Channing is... Here, Clara said quickly. In the city. He's staying at a hotel. Adrian looked at Serena. A single look. Serena was already on her phone. I'll have someone with him in 20 minutes, Adrian said. He doesn't know he might need protection, Clara said. He will in 5 minutes, Adrian said. Serena. Calling now, Serena said. Clara watched this and felt the particular disorienting quality of a world in which safety was organized not through the institutions she had spent her career within, but through a different structure entirely, one that moved faster and required less paperwork and operated according to a logic she was still learning. She thought about whether she was comfortable with this. She had been thinking about it in varying degrees of intensity since the storage facility in Queens. Since the Whitmore Grand, really, if she was honest with herself. She was not fully comfortable with it. She was also not willing to pretend that the institutions she had trusted had protected Paul Channing or Richard Aldridge or the 312 workers or her own 11 months of work. The world was not giving her a clean choice. It was giving her the choice that was actually available, which was different from the one she would have designed. She had made it. She was living with it. I'm going to tell you something, she said to Adrian. And I want you to hear it as something I mean, not as something I'm saying for effect. He turned to look at her. What you're doing here, the speed of it, the precision, the way you've moved through every obstacle these men have tried to put up, it's extraordinary. You've done in 4 days what I couldn't do in 11 months. She held his gaze. And I understand that the methods exist in a space that I'm not always comfortable with. I know what you are. I knew before the ballroom in the research context, kind of knowing, and I know more clearly now from watching you work. She paused. I'm not asking you to be different. I'm not asking you to justify it. I just want you to know that I see it clearly, and I'm still here. Not because I'm naive, and not because I'm desperate. Because the truth needed a vehicle, and the vehicles I tried before didn't move. Adrian was very still. The composed, measured quality of him was present as always, but there was something beneath it that she was getting better at reading the thing that moved when she said something that reached past the surface. Most people, he said, who understand clearly what I am, tend to stand considerably further away from me. I'm aware, she said. I'm choosing not to. A pause. Why? He asked. She thought about it honestly. Because dishonest answers were something she had stopped giving herself a long time ago. Because Richard told me once that the most dangerous assumption in this work was that the good people and the effective people were always the same people. She said. He said if you went looking only for good people, you'd miss the truth half the time. And if you went looking only for effective ones, you'd stop caring about the truth eventually. She looked at Adrian. You're the most effective person I've ever encountered, and I think under everything you still care about the truth. Even when fear was the only language. I think the truth mattered even then. He held her gaze for a long moment. Richard Aldridge was a wise man, he said. He was the best person I knew, she said. The moment was interrupted as moments in that office consistently were by Serena, who said without preamble, We have a problem. The problem was Marcus Hale. He had given an interview. Not to the journalists Clara had expected him to target, not to the financial press, or the legal affairs outlets. He had given it to a major national television program, recorded already submitted and scheduled for broadcast at 11 the following morning. Serena had learned of it through a contact at the network who had flagged it as significant. What does it contain? Clara asked. We don't have the full content, Serena said. But the promo materials describe it as a major revelation about criminal involvement in what they're calling a targeted extortion campaign against prominent business leaders. Serena looked up. They're promoting it as an exclusive from a credible source with documented evidence. He has something, Clara said. He didn't go on television without something. He has documentation, Adrian said quietly. She looked at him. The tone in those 3 words was specific, not surprised, not alarmed. Something closer to the tone of a person who has just confirmed a suspicion they were hoping would not be confirmed. You know what it is, she said. A pause. The pause he used when he was deciding how much to share, which she had learned to identify, and which she knew now was not deception. It was the habit of someone who had operated in privacy for a long time, learning in real time that transparency was possible with this particular person. There is documentation, he said, of my prior involvement in certain matters that the presentation of would be highly damaging to the credibility of everything we have built this week. Specifically, documentation that connects me to events from 3 years ago, that in the right framing would support Hale's narrative that you are operating in alliance with criminal interests. The room was very quiet. He's had this for how long? She asked. I don't know when he acquired it, Adrian said. Long enough to prepare it for a television audience. And it's real documentation, not fabricated. The events it documents occurred, Adrian said. The framing that will be applied to them is selective. Selective, like the framing they applied to my investigation, she said. A more sophisticated version of the same approach, he said. She thought about this. She thought about it with the specific focused speed she used when a problem had a time constraint and she could not afford to think slowly. What happened 3 years ago? She asked. He looked at her. I told you earlier tonight. She said that I see clearly what you are, and I'm still here. I meant it. What happened 3 years ago? He held her gaze. And then for the second time since the Whitmore Grand, something underneath his composure moved. Someone I should have protected, he said, was destroyed by people connected to 2 of the 8 men. I became aware of it after the fact. I responded in a manner that was not within legal parameters. He paused. It involved 2 of Hale's associates. The damage to those individuals was significant. There is a documented record of that. Clara thought about what significant meant from Adrian Valenti. She thought about it without flinching. And Hale is going to use it to say that what's happening to them now is the same thing, she said. Organized criminal violence against business people who decline to cooperate with an extortion scheme. That is what the framing will suggest, Adrian said. She thought about the 11 a.m. broadcast, about the federal investigation that was active but not yet resolved, about her public statement, Paul Channing's 5 sentences, and the day's worth of momentum that a well-placed television interview with documented material could complicate significantly. She thought about Clara Bennett's name in the 3rd paragraph of Hale's earlier statement, and what it would mean if that name was now connected through a major broadcast to whatever the documentation showed. "We have until 11 tomorrow morning," she said. "Yes," Adrian said. "Then we have tonight," she said. She looked at Serena. "Can we find out what network contact he used to submit the interview?" "I have a name already," Serena said. "Can we find out if the producer assigned to the segment has seen the full documentation or only what Hale provided?" Serena was already typing. "The producer is important," Clara said. "A producer doing their job correctly is going to verify the documentation before it airs. If we can get the context for what the documentation actually shows, the 3 years ago context, the full situation, not Hale's framing in front of that producer before 11 a.m. We change the story the segment tells." Adrian looked at her. "You want to counterbrief the producer. I want to give them the complete picture," she said, "which is what journalists are supposed to have before they broadcast something." She looked at him. "Are you willing to have your 3 years ago situation explained to a television producer tonight?" The question was as direct as anything she had asked him. He held her gaze. She understood what she was asking. She was asking him to expose something he had kept in the private operational record of a man who survived on controlled information. She was asking him to trust a process he had spent years operating outside of. She was asking him to do what she had asked of Alcott, to step forward rather than hold. "The person from 3 years ago," she said quietly. "Who was it?" "His name was James," Adrian said. "He was 24 years old. He had built a small investment platform that was legitimate, that was working, that was beginning to threaten the interests of one of Hale's associates. They destroyed it. And they destroyed him alongside it the same way false allegations, institutional manipulation. He didn't have the resources to fight it. He had a younger sister he was supporting and a mother who was ill, and by the time they were done with him, he had lost everything." He stopped. He died. Not from violence. From what the destruction did to him over 18 months. He was 26 years old when he died. The silence in the room was absolute. Clara thought about Richard, who had been 71 and had given 40 years. She thought about James, who had been 26 and had given whatever 26 years contained before it ended. She thought about 8 men in a ballroom laughing. "That's why," she said. "Not a question. I told you the truth earlier," he said. "Fear was the only language I believed powerful people understood. And then I watched a 26-year-old die because I didn't act when I could have. And I understood something I had not let myself understand before." He looked at her. "Fear protects. But it doesn't correct. It doesn't restore. It just prevents the next thing." He paused. "What you've built this week, the evidence Channing Alcott, the legal record that corrects, that restores. That's different from anything I've done. We built it," she said. He looked at her. "Together," she said. "This week. It was both of us." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what you need to give to the producer." They worked through the night for the second time in 4 days, and by 3 a.m., Serena had identified the producer. Catherine had made contact through a professional channel that established credibility. And Adrian, with Clara beside him, shaping the framing, had provided a documented counter-context for every element of the 3 years ago situation that would appear in Hale's interview. Not a denial, not a cover-up. An explanation of what James had been, what had been done to him, and what Adrian's response had been, and why. Clara was the one who suggested including James's name. "If you name him," she said, "he's not a detail in someone else's narrative anymore. He's a person. The same way Richard is a person. The same way Paul Channing is a person. She looked at Adrian. Let him be in the record. Adrian agreed. James Whitfield Carter. 24 years old when his platform was destroyed. 26 when he died. A younger sister named Denise. A mother named Ruth. They were in the counter brief that reached the producer at 4:17 a.m. At 8:30, the producer called Catherine and said the segment had been postponed pending further verification. At 9:45, Clara received a text from an unknown number, not Adrian. She knew his numbers, now all four of them saying simply, "You should have stayed destroyed. This isn't over." She showed it to Adrian. He read it. His jaw tightened barely in the way it did when something mattered more than he wanted to display. "Hale?" he said. "Probably," she said. "He's scared," he said. "Scared people make mistakes," she said. "You told me that in a different way on the night of the ballroom." She pocketed the phone. "Let him." At 11:15, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced that charges had been formally filed against Dennis Rourke, Daniel Cross, and Marcus Hale. Alan Mercer and David Foss were named as cooperating witnesses. The announcement stated that the investigation was continuing and additional charges were expected. Clara was sitting in Adrian's office when the announcement came through Serena's screen. She read it. She read it again. And then she put both hands flat on the desk and breathed. Not because she was breaking down, because something that had been braced inside her for 11 months, since the night she sat in her car in the hospital parking structure and did not cry finally, for one moment did not need to be braced anymore. "Richard," she said quietly. To no one in particular. To him, wherever that landed. Adrian across the desk did not say anything. He simply stayed. Which was, she was beginning to understand what he did when something mattered. He stayed. The charges against Rourke, Cross, and Hale had been public for 6 hours when Clara's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Not unusual. In the 48 hours since her video statement, she had received calls from journalists, former colleagues, strangers who had found her contact information through the coverage, and twice from people who identified themselves as victims of companies the 8 men had destroyed and who wanted to know if there was someone they could talk to. She had answered every one of those last calls personally and passed each name to Catherine Voss, who was already building what she described as a parallel civil documentation effort that would run alongside the federal criminal proceedings. But this number was different. She knew it was different before she answered the way you sometimes knew things before the information arrived to explain the feeling. She answered, "Ms. Bennett?" A woman's voice, professional, precise. "My name is Andrea Gaines. I'm a senior investigator with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York." Clara sat up straighter. "Ms. Gaines, I'd like to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience," Gaines said. "We've reviewed the materials submitted to our office, and we've reviewed your public statement and Mr. Channing's corroboration. I want to speak with you directly about the original investigation and the events of the past week." A pause that carried professional weight. "I also want to be transparent with you that this conversation will include some difficult questions about certain methods used in evidence recovery." Clara had been expecting this. She had told herself she was expecting it. But the moment of hearing it said directly, certain methods used in evidence recovery, landed with a particular concreteness. "I understand," she said. "I'll bring my attorney." "Of course," Gaines said. "And Ms. Bennett, I want you to know that the purpose of this meeting is not adversarial toward you. The materials you provided and the circumstances under which they were obtained are something we need to address carefully. But the investigation itself, what you built, what was done to destroy it, is not in question." "What was done to destroy it?" Clara repeated. "No," Gaines said. "It is not," Clara told Catherine within 2 minutes of ending the call. Catherine's response was organized and immediate, the response of someone who had been anticipating exactly this and had a plan already assembled. "The storage facility is the central question," Catherine said. "How we characterize what happened there will determine the exposure. The good news is that the documentation itself, the fabricated evidence against you, the correspondence, the Channing materials. All of that has independent evidentiary value, regardless of how it was obtained. The U.S. Attorney's Office has it now through official channels. What they need from you is the narrative account. What do I say about how we got in? You say what's true, Catherine said. You were invited to participate in an access operation conducted by a third party in connection with materials you had reason to believe related to evidence fabricated against you. You identified the materials upon access. You transmitted nothing yourself that was Serena. You were present in the capacity of a material witness identifying relevant documentation. That's technically accurate, Clara said. It is accurate, Catherine said. Not technically. Actually. She paused. The storage unit was under a contract to Rourke's subsidiary. Rourke used those materials to destroy your career and kill a federal investigation. The question of access is not nothing, but it is not the most important question in this case. The U.S. Attorney's Office knows that. That's why Gaines called you directly and told you the investigation is not adversarial toward you. Clara sat with this for a moment. And Adrian? The pause from Catherine was brief. Adrian Valenti is a separate matter for the U.S. Attorney's Office, she said. You cooperated with him. You are not responsible for the full scope of his operations. Your role is to be truthful about what you knew, what you did, and what your purpose was. Those are defensible in every respect. He's going to be exposed by this, Clara said. The federal process is going to surface him. Possibly, Catherine said. He's a sophisticated man who has operated for many years. He'll have his own legal representation. That's not your responsibility. Clara knew it wasn't her responsibility. She also knew that the man who had spent 3 days researching 8 men before she said a single word to him, who had cleared political obstacles at dawn, before delivering evidence to federal offices, who had named James Whitfield Carter in a counterbrief at 4 in the morning, because she asked him to, that man was going to face a reckoning from the same institutions she was now cooperating with. And she did not know exactly how she felt about that. She thought about it honestly. She felt 2 things at the same time that did not resolve cleanly into each other. She felt that justice required the truth to be in the legal record, and that the legal record was exactly where this case was headed. And she felt that Adrian Valenti had done something this week that the institutions now pursuing him had failed to do for 11 months and 7 years before that. Both of these things were true. She was going to have to live with both of them being true. She called Adrian. He answered on the second ring. Gaines from the U.S. Attorney's Office called me, she said. I know, he said. She's been circling for 18 hours. Has she contacted you directly? Through an intermediary, he said. My attorney has been in communication with her office since yesterday morning. You already knew this was coming, she said. Of course, he said. Not coldly, simply. The way he stated things that were obvious to him. Any operation that channels evidence to federal authorities is going to result in federal authorities asking questions about the operation. That's how the process works. Are you prepared for it? A pause. I've been prepared for this kind of conversation for a long time, he said. The specific form it takes changes. The existence of it is not a surprise. She thought about what that meant. Years of operating in a space where federal attention was an ambient condition rather than an acute event. A kind of life she could not fully imagine and was not sure she wanted to. What do you need from me? She asked. Nothing, he said. This part is separate from you. Your role in this week is clear and it's clean. What I've done over the years before this week is a different file. I'm going to tell the truth about what happened, she said, about my role in it. I wanted you to know that. I expected that, he said. I would be concerned if you didn't. The truth about my role includes the fact that I made choices knowing what I knew about you, she said. I'm not going to pretend I was deceived or that I didn't understand what I was involved in. A pause. Clara, he said. Her first name, which he had not used before. It landed differently than she expected, not intimate exactly, but precise, like something he had considered and decided was the right word. Tell the truth. That's what you've been doing since the beginning. Don't change it for my benefit." "I'm not doing it for your benefit," she said. "I'm doing it because it's the only way I know how to do this." "I know," he said. She breathed. "How is this going to end for you?" A longer pause this time. "Honestly," he said. "Yes," she said. "Always." "The federal matter will result in a period of significant legal attention," he said. "Certain operations will be disrupted. There will be agreements reached and accommodations made. I've navigated versions of this before. It will not be clean or easy, but I've been doing this for 20 years, and I understand how the negotiation works." He paused. "What I can tell you is that the people I have working with me, Serena, others will be protected. That's the most important thing to me." "Is that all that's important to you right now?" she asked. She had not planned to ask it that directly. But it was 4 days since the Whitmore Grand, and she had crossed lines she couldn't uncross, and she was going to be honest with a federal investigator in 48 hours, and she was done being careful about things that deserved a direct question. Another pause, his longest yet. "No," he said. One word, delivered in the same even tone as everything he said, which somehow made it heavier than if he had said it differently. She did not respond immediately. "I'll come by the office tonight," she said finally. "If that's all right." "It's all right," he said. The meeting with Andrea Gaines happened 2 days later in a federal building conference room, with Catherine on one side, and a court reporter in the corner, and a legal assistant who never spoke but wrote constantly in a notebook. Gaines herself was exactly what her phone voice had suggested. Precise, organized, carrying the particular contained energy of a career federal prosecutor who had done this long enough to have no interest in theater. Clara told the truth, all of it in the order it had happened with the precision she applied to everything. The original investigation, the collapse, the night at the Whitmore Grand, and the conversation that had not been planned, and the decision she had made in a midtown office with a USB drive in her hand. She did not minimize her knowledge of what Adrian was. She did not exaggerate it. She described it accurately. The research context awareness, the things she had chosen to set aside, the things she had not been able to set aside but had decided to proceed with anyway. She described the storage facility honestly using the framing Catherine had prepared, which was accurate and appropriate. She described Paul Channing's call. She described the conversation with Alcott in his living room in Brooklyn. She described James Whitfield Carter, who was 26 years old when he died because she had decided that James was in the record now, and she was not going to leave him out. Gaines listened to all of it with the focused, unhurried attention of a professional who understood that the complete picture was always more useful than the convenient one. When Clara finished, Gaines was quiet for a moment. "Ms. Bennett," she said, "I want to ask you one direct question, and I want you to understand it's not a trap. It's something I need to understand for the purposes of this investigation." "Go ahead," Clara said. "At the point when you understood fully what Mr. Valenti was, and what his operational methods included." Gaines said, "Why did you continue?" Clara had known this question was coming since the moment Gaines called. She had prepared for it. Not with a scripted answer. Scripted answers were how people got into trouble in rooms like this one, but with an honest one. Because 11 months earlier, she said, "I built a clean case using every correct method available to me. I followed every procedure. I documented everything properly. I did exactly what the institution trained me to do, and 8 men destroyed it, destroyed Richard Aldridge, and walked away without consequence. And the institutional mechanisms that were supposed to prevent that did not. They failed completely." She held Gaines's gaze. "I continued because the truth existed, and I had found someone who could help me reach it. And I knew that reaching it mattered more than the comfort of remaining completely clean." She paused. "I'm not asking for absolution. I made the choice with open eyes, and I'll accept whatever that means legally. But if you're asking whether I would make the same choice again, given what the choice produced, the federal charges. Channing's corroboration, the record for 312 workers, Richard's name cleared. I can't tell you. I wouldn't." Gaines looked at her for a long, assessing moment. "Thank you for being direct," she said. "It's the only thing I know how to be," Clara said. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When it was done, Gaines walked Clara to the elevator herself, which Catherine later told her was unusual. At the elevator, Gaines said, "I want you to know something off the record." Clara looked at her. "Your original investigation," Gaines said. "The one from 11 months ago. I was in a different division at the time, but I was aware of the case. I was aware when it collapsed." She paused. "I thought something was wrong with how it went. I didn't have grounds to pursue it. I've thought about that." Another pause. "I'm glad you didn't stop." The elevator came. Clara stepped in. She held herself together through the lobby and through the revolving door and onto the sidewalk outside the federal building where the city was doing what it always did, moving loudly without concern for any single person's significant moments. And then she stood on the sidewalk in the middle of all of it and let herself feel the weight of what had just happened. Not the relief yet. The weight first. All of it. Every month of it. The night in the hospital parking structure, and the practiced smile, and the $11, and the dress she had almost returned 3 times, and the 11 pages of notes at 4 in the morning, and every conversation, and every decision, and every moment where she had been afraid, but kept going anyway. She let it sit on her for exactly 1 minute. Then she picked up her phone and called Paul Channing. He answered immediately. "How did it go?" he said. "Honestly," she said. "Good," he said. "That's the only way to do this." "How are you?" she asked. A pause. "Strange," he said. "Not bad. Strange. I've been in Vermont for 6 years trying not to think about any of this, and now I can't stop thinking about it, and it turns out that thinking about it while things are actually moving is entirely different from thinking about it while nothing is." "Does it feel better?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "It feels real," he said. "Which is different from better but maybe more important." She understood exactly what he meant. 3 weeks later, the indictments expanded. Marcus Hale was charged with 19 counts, including obstruction of justice fraud and conspiracy charges that encompassed both the operation against Clara's investigation and the earlier operation against Paul Channing. The prior 12 years of his use of Thomas Alcott's professional credibility produced 4 additional charges covering incidents Clara had not known about. Alcott himself negotiated a cooperation agreement that resulted in a reduced exposure and required him to testify to the full scope of what he knew. Dennis Rourke pleaded guilty on the second day of proceedings, which surprised his own attorney. Clara suspected it did not surprise Adrian. Daniel Cross negotiated a cooperation deal that had apparently been in progress since the night of the Whitmore Grand when Adrian had what he described as a comprehensive conversation with him. The deal required full testimony and the surrender of $14 million in assets that had been accumulated through the operations the 8 men had run collectively. Thomas Alcott's testimony about the prior incidents surfaced 2 additional victims. A compliance officer named Maria Reyes, who had investigated one of Hale's funds in 2017 and been pushed out through a fabricated personal misconduct narrative, and a small investment firm whose principals had challenged a Hale associate and found their professional licenses inexplicably challenged 6 months later. Both contacted Catherine's office. Both had documentation they had preserved. The 312 workers Clara had named, every one of them, were identified as victims in the federal proceeding. Their cases became part of the civil restitution framework that the prosecution was building alongside the criminal charges. Gerald Whitfield in Geneva retained Swiss counsel and fought extradition for 9 weeks before his attorneys informed him that the extradition treaty was going to hold, and the asset freeze was going to hold, and the most advantageous option remaining was to cooperate from abroad. He began cooperating in the 7th week of fighting, which meant he cooperated for 2 weeks before surrendering, which his attorneys probably advised against, but which Clara understood. Some people needed to fight all the way to the wall before they could admit the wall was there. Vincent Shaw and David Foss cooperated early and completely as she had predicted they would. Shaw was a reader of rooms. He read this one accurately. Alan Mercer, who had reached out through an intermediary the morning after the Rourke story broke, turned out to have kept records of his own, a private insurance policy of documentation that he had maintained for years without being certain he would ever use it. The records went back 8 years and described the inner financial workings of the group's operations in a level of detail that the prosecution described privately as the most significant single evidentiary submission in the case. Clara learned this from Catherine, who had learned it from a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and she sat with it for a long time. 8 years of records. A man who had participated in what they were doing and simultaneously documented it with the methodical, protected care of someone who understood at some level that it was wrong and wanted a way out that didn't destroy him entirely. People were complicated. She had always known that. She knew it more completely now. Richard Aldridge's name was formally cleared by the regulatory body that had accepted the false misconduct narrative 11 months earlier. The clearing was public, detailed, and explicit, not a quiet administrative correction, but a documented restoration of professional record that named what had been done to him and stated clearly that his work had been sound and his integrity unimpeachable. Clara received the notification at 7 in the morning and sat with her phone in her hands for a long time. She had not let herself fully imagine this moment. She had been afraid of imagining it and having it not arrive. She had protected herself from the specific hope of it by keeping her focus on the work rather than the outcome. Now it was here. She said his name, just his name, and then she sat in the quiet of her apartment and let herself cry for the first time since the hospital parking structure properly and completely, not for 8 minutes, but for 40, and she did not try to stop it or manage it or make it useful. She just let it be what it was. When it was over, she felt something she recognized from the physical world. The specific exhaustion after something that had been held for a very long time was finally set down. She washed her face. She made coffee. She drank it while it was hot. She called Paul Channing. "I know," he said before she could speak. "I saw it this morning." "He deserved it," she said. "He did," Paul said. "Are you all right?" "I think so," she said. "I will be." She paused. "Are you?" "Better than I've been in 7 years," he said. "Which is not the same as fine, but better is something." "Better is something," she agreed. She had been thinking in the weeks since the charges were filed about what came next professionally. She had not been employed in any formal capacity since her career collapsed 11 months before. She had been offered 2 positions in the period since her public statement, both from firms who had seen the coverage and wanted, she suspected as much, the narrative value of hiring her as the actual professional capability she brought. She had turned both down. What she wanted to do was not work inside an existing institution. What she wanted to do was harder to name precisely, but she had been naming it gradually over the course of several conversations with Catherine Voss, who turned out to be not only an excellent attorney, but an excellent thinking partner, the kind of person who asked the right question just slightly before you were ready to answer it. She wanted to build something that could do what the institution she had worked for had failed to do. Not a firm in the conventional sense, something smaller and more focused, and independent investigative practice specialized in the financial misconduct that existing institutions were too slow or too compromised to address. Something that worked in the spaces the formal system left open. Something that could take on cases like hers and like Paul Channing's and like Maria Reyes's before they got 11 months into destruction. She told Paul about it during one of their calls in the 5th week after the charges. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd want to be involved in that." She had hoped he would say that. She had not asked directly because she did not want to pull him back into something difficult before he was ready, but she had hoped. "Your experience with federal investigations," she said, "and mine with corporate financial structures. Together, those cover most of what we'd need methodologically. We'd need funding," he said. "I'm working on it," she said. She had been working on it. One of the things she had established in the weeks since the charges was a formal victim compensation fund administered through the federal proceedings. $14 million from Cross's asset surrender. Additional amounts from the civil restitution process. It was not money she could touch directly, but the process of organizing it had connected her with 3 individuals in the financial and philanthropic space who were interested in supporting the kind of work she was describing. One of them was a woman named Eleanor Marsh, 73 years old, who had founded a financial regulation advocacy organization 15 years earlier, after watching her son lose his company to exactly the kind of corporate manipulation the 8 men had practiced. Eleanor had watched the proceedings with the particular focused attention of someone who had been waiting for this story for 15 years. She had contacted Clara through Catherine in the 4th week. They had spoken twice. The second conversation lasted 3 hours. Eleanor said, "I've been trying to build what you're describing from the top down for 15 years. I've never found the person to build it from the inside out, someone who actually knows the mechanics." She had paused. "I think I've found her now." Clara had not said yes yet. She was thinking carefully which was how she did everything. But she was going to say yes. She knew she was going to say yes. Adrian's legal situation resolved in the 7th week in a manner that Catherine described as a sophisticated negotiated outcome, and that Clara understood from what she could read between the lines of what Catherine was permitted to tell her as Adrian Valenti, doing what he had always done, operating in the spaces between formal structures with the precision and preparation that had defined everything she had watched him do. There were no criminal charges filed against him. There was an agreement the terms of which were not public that apparently involved cooperation on certain matters of interest to federal investigators that had nothing to do with the 8 men and everything to do with the longer history of Adrian's operations and the information he had accumulated over 20 years of moving through the world the way he moved through it. He was, as Catherine put it, comprehensively useful to people who needed to be useful to. Clara understood this. She also understood that he had been a different kind of useful to the 8 men's victims, and that those 2 kinds of useful did not cancel each other out. He called her the day his legal situation resolved. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "Catherine told me as much as she could." "I'm sorry it took this long," he said. "You were dealing with the consequences of your own choices," she said. "That's not something to be sorry about." A pause. "I want to see you," he said. "I know," she said. "Is that all right?" She thought about it. Not because the answer was uncertain. She had known what the answer was for most of the 7 weeks since the ballroom. She was thinking about it because it was a significant thing, and she took significant things seriously, and she believed they deserved the weight of actual consideration rather than the relief of saying the easy thing quickly. "Yes," she said. "Come for dinner. I'll cook. I'm told I'm adequate at it, which is probably accurate." He made the sound that might have been a laugh again, and this time she was certain enough that she smiled. "7," he said. "7?" she said. He came at 7:02, which she suspected was the first time in his adult life he had arrived at anything 2 minutes late, and the reason became clear when he was at the door, and she saw that he was carrying a bottle of wine, with a label she recognized as expensive, and a small paper bag that turned out to contain exactly the kind of pastry from a specific bakery that she had mentioned in passing once at 1 in the morning in his office during the sequence of conversations that had changed everything. He had remembered. Of course he had. She put the pastries on the kitchen counter and poured him a glass of water because the wine was for later, and turned to find him standing in her kitchen with the same composed, unhurried quality he always had, but with something different underneath it. Something that had not been present in the same way at the Whitmore Grand, or in the Midtown office, or even in the counterbrief at 4 in the morning. He looked like a man who was for the first time in a while somewhere he had chosen to be for reasons that had nothing to do with operational necessity. "You were right about Alcott," he said. "I've been thinking about it. The approach you took the daughter, the appeal to what he actually knew rather than what he had told himself. I would have applied pressure." He paused. "Pressure would have produced a worse result." "You would have adapted," she said. "Eventually," he said. "Less efficiently than you." She looked at him across the kitchen. "Is that you admitting someone did something better than you would have?" "It's me stating an accurate assessment," he said, "which happens to be that yes." She smiled. "Not the practiced one." The actual one, which she had almost forgotten the feeling of from the inside, the way it arrived without calculation, without planning, without being assembled as a performance. Just arrived. He looked at her when she smiled, and the thing that had moved in his expression at the Whitmore Grand when he first noticed her, and again in the office when she said the truth, needed a vehicle. And again, when she told him James should be in the record, that thing was present again, fully, without being managed or contained. "There it is," he said quietly. "What?" she said, though she knew. "Your smile," he said. "The real one." She held it. She didn't perform it or extend it or make anything of it. She just let it be on her face, which was enough. "You noticed it was gone," she said. "The night of the ballroom," he said. "Yes." "You noticed before I told you anything," she said. "Before you knew who I was or what had happened." "I told you," he said. "I noticed things." She thought about that. About the specific quality of being seen before being known. The way it had broken through 11 months of performance in a ballroom full of people who had watched her fall without seeing her standing. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "What you did this week, not the methods, not the operation, but what you actually did. You gave truth a way to get into the room. You moved things that were immovable. You gave Channing 7 years a destination. You put James in the record." She looked at him directly. "And you did it because you could not do it anymore. Not because someone asked you, because you couldn't keep carrying the other version." He was very still. "I recognize that," she said, "because I couldn't either. That's what the ballroom was for me. I couldn't keep performing. I couldn't keep holding the weight of the truth alone and calling that survival." She paused. "You saw it, and then you did something about it. Not for me, because you couldn't not." "No," he said quietly. "Not only for that reason." She held his gaze. "Tell me the other reason." "Because the woman standing against a wall in an emerald green dress, fighting to stay standing after everything that had been done to her, was the most honest person I had seen in 20 years, he said. "And I have not been able to stop thinking about that. Not for a day. Not since the moment I asked who killed your smile and you pointed across a room and told me the truth without flinching." He paused. "I've spent 20 years moving through a world where nobody told the truth directly, where everything was managed and filtered and strategic. And there you were, exhausted and angry and absolutely clear about what you knew and what you wanted and what you wouldn't accept." He looked at her. "I didn't move on 8 men only because of James. I moved on them because you exist, and because what they had done to someone like you was something I found I could not tolerate." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city moved in its perpetual, indifferent way. Inside, 2 people who had each carried something enormous alone for too long stood close enough together that the distance between carrying it alone and not was simply a matter of deciding. "I'm not easy," she said. It was important to say. "I don't do anything halfway. I argue with people when I think they're wrong. I call people at 3 in the morning. I build 11-page documents when I can't sleep. I am not going to stop caring about the truth regardless of what it costs or what it looks like or who it involves." "I know," he said. "Including you," she said. "If you do something I think is wrong, I will tell you." "I'm counting on it," he said. "You say that now." "I mean it," he said. "I spent 20 years surrounded by people who told me what I wanted to hear. I don't want that." He looked at her. "I want exactly what you just described. Someone who argues, who calls at 3 in the morning, who tells me when I'm wrong." He paused. "Someone who tells the truth, even about me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then we understand each other," she said. He extended his hand across the kitchen counter. Not dramatic, not romantic in the performed sense. Just a hand open, offered with the directness that was his native language. She put her hand in it. She felt his fingers close around hers, steady, warm, the grip of someone who had no intention of letting go before she decided she was ready. She didn't decide that for a while. The wine was very good. Dinner was adequate as promised, and he said so honestly when she asked which made her laugh for the first time in 11 months in the easy, unplanned way The kind of laugh that didn't need to be evaluated after. They talked for 4 hours. Not about the case. They had said everything that needed saying about the case. They talked about Richard because she wanted him to know who Richard was beyond the name in the record, about Vermont and Paul Channing, and the quiet accounting firm that was going to be a very different kind of quiet by next year when the story was fully written. About James because James mattered, and Clara believed that people who mattered should be talked about. About the thing she was building with Eleanor Marsh, and what it would require and where it could go. About the fact that Adrian Valenti, who had operated for 20 years in spaces the formal world left dark, had reached a point where the formal world had caught up with him enough that he was going to spend the foreseeable future in a different kind of arrangement, not gone, not finished, but different. Negotiated. "Is that hard?" she asked. "It's unfamiliar," he said, "which is its own kind of hard." "You'll adapt," she said. He looked at her. "You said that to me earlier, about Alcott." "I was right about Alcott." He considered this. "Yes," he said. "You were." "Then trust me on this one too," she said. He held her gaze. "I trust very few people," he said. "I know," she said. "You're one of them," he said. She did not make it small. She didn't deflect or qualify or protect herself from the weight of it. She accepted it for what it was, something rare from someone who did not offer it easily, offered now because it was true. "Good," she said. She meant it to be more than a single word. He understood it as more. Months later in the coverage that would accumulate around the case as it moved through federal proceedings and into the kind of legal history that law school professors would one day use as examples of how systemic financial misconduct operated and how it could be dismantled. Clara Bennett's name appeared in a specific way, not as a victim, as the investigator who broke it open. Paul Channing's name appeared alongside hers, 7 years of preservation finally given its proper accounting. Thomas Alcott was described as a cooperating witness whose testimony was pivotal in establishing the 12-year pattern. The 312 workers were named in the victim impact materials, every one of them which had been one of Clara's specific requirements in her cooperation with the prosecution. Richard Aldridge's name appeared in the case summary as the foundational investigator whose original work had identified the target and whose documented methodology was later confirmed as sound. Not a footnote, not a casualty, a foundation. Eleanor Marsh's organization, restructured with Clara as its operational director, and Paul as senior investigative consultant, opened its doors in the spring. The caseload in the first 60 days was larger than they had planned, for which Catherine told them was a predictable consequence of being the first credible operation in this specific space, and which Clara told Catherine was a problem she was extremely glad to have. The emerald dress hung in the back of her closet. She did not return it. She did not throw it away. She kept it because it was the dress she had worn on the night everything started moving, and some things deserved to be kept, not because you needed them anymore, but because forgetting where you came from was its own kind of loss. Adrian came by the new office on the first day it opened. He did not make an event of it. He arrived mid-morning with 2 cups of coffee and looked at the organized, purposeful activity of a small team doing something that mattered and said simply, "Good." Clara took the coffee. "Good is a start," she said. "It's more than a start," he said. "You know that." She looked at him across the room that she had built that had Paul's careful handwriting on a whiteboard in the corner, and Catherine's legal framework in a folder on the desk, and Eleanor's funding in the account, and the names of 312 workers filed in a cabinet because they deserved to have their names somewhere real. "Yes," she said. "I know that." She had walked into the Whitmore Grand 11 months earlier with a practice smile and $11 and the absolute refusal to let them see her broken. She had walked out with something she could not have named that night, but could name now the beginning of the only thing that had ever been able to stand against the machinery of powerful people protecting themselves. The truth with a way to move. Richard had spent 40 years believing it. Paul had spent 7 years preserving it. Clara had spent 11 months fighting for it, and now finally standing in the office she had built from the ruins of what had been taken from her, with the evidence in the record, and the names on the wall, and the work still ahead, and the man who had seen her when she was fighting to stay standing. Now standing beside her, she understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. You could lose everything they were willing to take from you. You could lose your career and your reputation, and the mentor who taught you that truth was worth protecting, and the year it cost you, and the smile you wore to survive. You could lose all of it and still not lose yourself. And if you did not lose yourself, the truth did not lose you either. It waited, as long as it needed to. And when you were finally ready to bring it home, it came, every word of it, every name, every piece of what they had taken and what they could not take, and what was always underneath all of it still standing, still there, still true.